the ringtone of her smartphone, ringing out close to lunchtime on a very ordinary working Thursday, once again divided Cassandra's life into the happy period before and the almost hopeless one after. The word "mum" popped up on the screen, and although calls in the middle of the day weren't too common, the woman had no misgivings about it. Maybe Mum missed her or wanted advice on clothing choices. Cassandra put a pencil dot in the margins of the sheet with a variant of the customer's contract and hurried to take the call, so as not to worry her family with a long wait. As soon as the woman heard her mother's voice, which sounded unusually muffled, it seemed to her that her heart plunged downwards. It was obvious that this was not a happy event, and the assumption was unfortunately confirmed. "Cassandrachka, hello you, don't worry too much, please. I happen to be in the hospital right now." "Cassandra, you're freaking out." "Mum, what happened? What hospital are you in? What did the doctors say to bring in? What's the room number?" A voice from the phone interrupted the flow of questions. "Cassandra, I'm begging you, don't worry. It's just like in the cinema. I slipped, fell, almost passed out, but I'm fine. My neighbor Maggie was passing by and she cheered me up and supported me while we waited for the ambulance. The doctor said I'll be fine, but I'll have to stay in hospital for a while." "Mum, why didn't you tell me before? I would have rushed over and helped. I didn't want to bother you in the middle of the day, but my office hours are 4 to 7 p.m. in the evening, and if you're going from the office to my house and then to the pharmacy, I was afraid you might not make it. In general, please write down what you need to bring here. The main policy and phone charger are needed. Water not carbonated yet, because for some reason I'm very thirsty." The invisible mum sighed, and the woman imagined how the face of her dear person was distorted from the painful shock and hurried to finish the conversation, specifying the number of the hospital and the room. Cassandra reread the list of things her mother had dictated to her, added chicken broth, wet wipes, and went to ask her supervisor to leave. "Mr. Jasper, please allow me to leave early today, for personal reasons. Mum's been admitted to hospital." The boss, a friend of Cassandra's husband's from his student days, expressed polite words of sympathy, and when he found out in which hospital Mum was lying, he encouraged his subordinate and inquired, "Well, the doctors in our regional almshouse are good. Maybe the atmosphere is not too luxurious, but the equipment and staff at the top. I've been in this hospital several times and I was discharged as good as new. So you're going to be fine. Don't get too excited. By the way, are you driving the car today or is Kevin driving it? Maybe Nicholas can give you a lift in his car." Cassandra was touched by her boss's concern and decided that she was in no position to refuse. "Thank you, Mr. Jasper. That would be very helpful. I won't keep the driver long. I just need to get to Mum's house. I won't keep Nicholas any longer. I'll collect the necessary things and then I'll call a taxi. Thank you." The supervisor wished Cassandra success and promised, "Come out in 15 minutes to the main entrance. I'll tell Nicholas to wait for you at your mother's house and drop you off at your and Kevin's family nest. He's coming back for me anyway, and your house is on the way." Thanking her sensitive boss again, Cassandra went to switch off the computer and tidy up her workplace. She had taken the contract with her so as not to let the whole team down and to complete the necessary work by the next morning. The woman was not very good at recognizing the meaning of the stories the driver was trying to entertain her with, but she was grateful that the flow of his speeches made her at least react in some way and prevented her from slipping into anxious thoughts. Following the list, ticking off each recorded item, Cassandra packed up her mother's flat, watered her favorite flowers. She shut off the gas and water just in case, checked to see if there was anything perishable in the fridge, collected the rubbish to throw away, and only then did she go downstairs and set off with the talkative Nicholas next. Not far from Cassandra and Kevin's house, there was a supermarket with a pharmacy inside, and the woman decided to stop there on the way. Asking Nicholas to stop by the container yard, she threw out the rubbish she had collected and rushed off to get some groceries. Moving almost on autopilot, Cassandra bought everything she needed and was soon preparing dinner for her husband and broth for her mother at the same time. While the food was boiling and baking, Cassandra called Kevin and explained the situation. "Kevin, Mum is in hospital. I'm going to go and see her. How long I'll be there, I'm not sure yet. dinner will be on the cooker." The man confessed. "I'm aware Jasper told me you need support. You wait for me. I'll try to get there early and we'll go to the hospital together. I'll be there for anything else you might need, but I'll be there for you."
Kevin didn't let his wife down and, grabbing her and the 2 bags she had packed, drove her to the hospital. Cassandra managed to persuade the nurse taking the bags to let her see her mum and the attending doctor, who was thankfully on site. Kevin remained waiting for his wife in the lobby, but gave words of kind words and wishes for a speedy recovery.
Bridget tried to smile when she saw Cassandra enter the room, but she was visibly uncomfortable and frightened. The woman said a soft but distinctive hello to everyone in the room and made her way to her mother's bed. A weight was suspended from the unfortunate woman's right leg, and her lips, bitten almost to the point of blood, were a clear indication that the ice victim was in a lot of pain. Cassandra listened to her mum's story of her predicament and, trying not to cry, began to put everything she had brought into the bedside table. The phone was immediately put on charge. Cassandra gave her mother some broth, made her eat a few spoonfuls of raw, grated carrots. The internet says that such a salad in the first days after the injury the best vitamin remedy. Then sour morsels you drink, also useful. "Oh, daughter, don't worry. You should probably run. Kevin will be home. He'll probably be surprised you're not here." Cassandra explained that her husband had rushed home when he heard what had happened, so she wouldn't have to take a taxi. That he hadn't been missed, but he'd said hello, as if just waiting for that line. The woman in the next bed became active. "The orderlies and nurses here are rude. She intervened in the conversation. You can't call them day or night. They drink tea, spin around in front of doctors, give chocolates, even give money without any use. They're still doing their jobs with their sleeves down." Cassandra kept silent, and having found out from her mother the name and patronymic of her attending doctor, went in search of him. The restless neighbor made a good point. In the residence room, if not, then in the dressing room. Look, there, probably, was someone courtesy. Thanking the grumpy woman dryly, Cassandra went out into the corridor. The nurses in the trauma room, accustomed to all sorts of relatives, tears and hysterics, looked at the visitor, asking how to find a doctor with a mixture of irritation and fatigue. But one of them, who held herself like a superior, answered thoroughly.
"Mr. Oliver is in the superintendent's office at the moment. At that end of the corridor is the penultimate door. Wait there, or there is a bench near the resident's room."
Cassandra waited for the doctor, and he recognized her as Bridget's daughter and invited her into the office. Showing a picture on the computer screen, Mr. Oliver explained. "If I may say so, your mum's fracture was a success. Generally, there are 2 treatment options." The man began to explain the nuances of each option, then asked, "Which option did you decide on?" Cassandra looked the doctor in the eyes but did not answer, but asked a counter question. "Tell me, Mr. Oliver, for example, if a patient with a fracture like my mother's was someone close to you, what would you recommend?" Smiling, the doctor replied briefly. "Osteosynthesis. A very similar case. My aunt, our head, performed a similar operation. It's been a year since she is active again, even in the countryside, so I cannot keep up with her." The woman clarified all the details of the upcoming operation, wrote down what else she needed to bring for the post-operative period, and having said goodbye to the doctor, left the office. Cassandra had to announce to her mother that the operation was scheduled for the next day, and having collected herself, the woman presented it as lightly as possible, trying not to upset her mother. "Tomorrow I will come and meet you after the operation. Everything will be fine, don't worry." "Cassandrachka, what about your work? The boss will probably scold you." "Don't worry about that. I'll do my job and I won't let you or the chief down." With the operation, the long road to Bridget being able to walk again had only just begun. For a fortnight, Cassandra visited her mum almost daily to feed and nurse her. The woman tried to object and repeatedly stated, "Cassandra, you take care of yourself. Don't come to see me so often. The food here is not bad, and I do not have an appetite. Where it will come from, if my energy is not spent on anything." But Bridget could not persuade her daughter. When the day of her discharge arrived, Cassandra went to the doctor for recommendations. Mr. Oliver was cautious and warned, Your mum is a very energetic lady. Well, I've made my point to her, and I'll make my point to you. I wouldn't be overly optimistic if I were you, but there's no need to despair. Although it is impossible to fully rely on the injured limb. Crutches are Bridget's best friends for the next month, and then you should also take care. Of course, it is necessary to move, but carefully. Prophylactic treatment is indicated to prevent pressure sores. I'll be expecting a follow-up X-ray in 6 weeks. We'll see how far along the bone is in the healing process. That's pretty much it. Cassandra checked. Maybe some vitamins for Mum to take? Mr. Oliver shrugged. Well, in principle you could. You'll have to get a rehabilitation plan from your local clinic. Cassandra called a taxi specializing in transporting people with limited mobility, and after a heroic journey through the streets, Bridget was finally in her flat. Cassandra faced a new problem. Her mum's physical condition still left much to be desired. Even a simple trip to the bathroom or kitchen could result in a new injury. For the first time, Cassandra came to Bridget twice a day, and by the New Year holidays she was almost exhausted. The traffic jams were taking up so much time that there were only a few hours left for sleep. Cassandra turned to her husband. Kevin, let's get Mum to come stay with us for a while. At least I won't have to go back and forth between flats. The man gloomed and after a languid pause replied, Cassandra, I'm wonderful to your mum. Bridget is a wonderful woman, but I'm sorry, but I'm going to be blunt. There's nowhere to put her here. I mean, it's a studio flat. It's a big room, but there's only one room. When I persuaded you to take out a mortgage, I didn't get any sympathy. Both you and your mum were against it. Kevin, you could put up a screen. It'll be like 2 rooms. Look, but Bridget would be uncomfortable in the first place. I play computer games. I listen to loud music all night. Besides, you should ask her if she'd be willing to move. I'm 100% sure she'll say no. Your mum is very tactful and wise and understands that the further away she lives, the better her relationship with her son-in-law will be. Kevin turned out to be right. Bridget, having barely heard the idea of her son-in-law and daughter moving into the flat, only snorted indignantly. There can't even be a conversation. The walls help at home. I will not go to you, especially there, and sit quietly. It will be uncomfortable. Cassandra obeyed her mother's will. She didn't want to argue with her husband. She continued to waste time standing in traffic, and the lawyer's position at Mr. Jasper's firm had to be vacated. With her boss's permission, Cassandra had transferred to a half-time position and was glad that her boss had been able to meet her needs. She prepared contracts, visited and trained her successor, and diligently performed all the duties that did not require constant presence in the office. Rehab, however, took a lot more money than the woman had realized. Sometimes she shared with her husband her indignation at the fact that pharmacies changed prices at will and tried to sell the most expensive version of a drug. That's when Kevin would start grumbling. Look, Cassandra, your mum must have some free medication. The woman tried not to answer. After all, the family budget was not suffering, and she had not asked her husband for money for almost 6 months since the fateful news of her mother's troubles. Cassandra had generally tried to deal with the situation on her own, without interfering with Kevin. As the weather changed, Cassandra's schedule, by tradition, remained almost unchanged. In the morning she made her husband's breakfast and, if she had time, made preparations for lunch and dinner. Then, after putting some of the breakfast in containers, she rushed to her mother's house, stopping at the shops and pharmacies on the way. Nursing, keeping her spirits up and helping her move around the flat took up a lot of her time. Cassandra would then run into the office as well and rush home for the evening. In case of any emergencies, her neighbor, the same Maggie who had helped her wait for the ambulance, had the key to her mother's flat. She would sometimes drop by to watch TV and gossip together. So Bridget wasn't abandoned, but Cassandra was desperate to get her mother back on her feet. And not just because she had to spend a lot of time traveling back and forth between the distant parts of the city every day, without holidays and weekends. Mum was simply the closest person to her. She had, in fact, given Cassandra the gift of life twice. The first time on her birthday 38 years ago, but more importantly later, when a terrible tragedy struck Cassandra in a terrible avalanche. It was her mother who was there for her in those black days, helping her to move around when her legs almost collapsed on nervous grounds, forcing her to drink and eat, then by persuasion, then through force. Abandoning her monetary and not dusty job, her mother sold the flat in their hometown and, almost like a huge and clumsy cube, moved it 2,000 kilometers away from the place where everything Cassandra reminded her of her inhuman grief. It was Bridget who had forced her into a job where it was almost impossible to be alone with her sad thoughts, where she had to look stylish and trim. Cassandra didn't consider her help to her mum to be a sacrifice and, despite her tiredness, tried to take care of her husband, especially since the 10th wedding anniversary was approaching, and the woman wanted to arrange a touching congratulation and a pleasant surprise for patient Kevin. She made a preliminary version of the menu, found a confectionery where orders were made according to individual designs, and agreed to prepare an unusual shaped cake for her husband, who loves sweets. The holiday was approaching, but shortly before it arrived, Kevin, during morning breakfast, warned, "Sorry, Cassandra, but I need a car for a few days. I have to go to the branch in the neighboring region, because it seems that the branch manager is messing up her reports, and the profits are down many times over. Although in other divisions everything is even, and in some places even growth is observed. Of course, I'll try to make a quick trip, but planes are unlikely to fly in those parts. I don't feel like traveling by train. Can you manage without a car?" Cassandra herself was counting on the faithful family horse, but she didn't argue. After all, her husband really needed the car more. She smiled. "I'll manage, of course." Kevin thanked her politely for breakfast and promised, "It's okay, we'll buy you an iron horse too. Once the situation at work normalizes a bit, you'll be able to choose a model." Running out of the house, the man kissed his wife on the cheek, winked and said, "Don't worry, I remember about our wedding anniversary. I'll try to be there by Friday evening." Taking advantage of her husband's absence, Cassandra moved in with her mother for a while so she wouldn't waste time traveling. During these few days, she managed to do a general cleaning, and the flat became somehow especially fresh in spring. Only on the eve of the holiday, Cassandra had to return home to bring her urgently needed diploma to the office. It was a good thing, though, because she also had to clean up the house and make some of Kevin's favorite salads. In the morning, the woman took the festive treats that had been put aside in separate containers and rushed to her mother's house. She habitually gave her a massage, helped her walk around her room, and even after waiting for the lift repairs to be completed, finally took her mother outside to enjoy the nice weather and enjoy the feeling of life returning to the way it was before the injury. After a short walk, Bridget and Cassandra had lunch, and the daughter began to apologize. "Mom, I'm sorry, please forgive me. I'm going to leave early today. I want to surprise Kevin. Turn the telly off when you get bored. Your phone is charged. Call me if you need anything, okay? Run, Cassandra. Happy holidays to you and Kevin. It's been 10 years together." Kissing her mom, Cassandra ran down the route she had planned. Spring, which had long ago come into its own and was rapidly approaching summer, gave soft warmth, and the sweet and tart scent of blossoming lilacs set her in the most romantic mood. Contrary to popular belief that getting married in May was a sign of trouble, she didn't have to worry about it in her second marriage. On the contrary, Kevin was a safe haven for a woman. There were no violent passions between them, but there was mutual sympathy and respect. Cassandra appreciated her husband for the fact that he did not pry into her soul, did not harass her with jealousy and suspicion, did not demand to give birth to an heir or heiress. It was only when he declared his intentions to be serious that Cassandra warned him directly and honestly that children were not part of her plans. The man was not frightened by this statement. A few years after the wedding, Kevin asked if she had changed her mind about the child, but having heard a categorical no, did not begin to find out the reasons and did not raise this topic again. The man was a good partner, and of course she loved him in her own way, with all the strength that a wounded heart was capable of. Following the list she'd made the day before, Cassandra bought drinks, got the calamari Kevin adored, and so she bought all sorts of little things: crusty baguette, fresh green salad, fruit. The 2 large shopping bags that Cassandra had thoughtfully brought with her gradually filled up. Hanging them on both shoulders, she ran into the pastry shop where she had ordered the cake. Now it was safe to go home. Cassandra looked hopefully at the family parking space and sighed with relief there was no car, so she would have time to set the table, hang the balloons, and dress up before her husband returned. She praised herself mentally for the handy bags, thanks to which one hand was free. Hurriedly opening the doors, the woman finally found herself in the family nest. Placing the box of cake on the banquet, Cassandra suddenly froze with surprise. In the familiar hum of a residential apartment building, there was a foreign sound coming from the kitchen. Strangely, there were no foreign shoes on the mat, no strangers' belongings visible, but the clatter of dishes came to her quite clearly. It was as if someone was moving a massive plate or a bulky mug. Kevin and Cassandra didn't have any pets. They had all wanted to get a cute dog, but unhappiness with Mum had tweaked that plan. It probably would have been much smarter to go out to the playground, close the door, and call her husband, but from exhaustion, Cassandra didn't act as safety dictated. Automatically pulling her trainers off her feet, and right with her bags on her shoulders, the woman walked into the kitchen and nearly collapsed in surprise. Tucking one leg under herself on a chair sat a boy of about 6 years old from the looks of it. The unknown little guest was completely engrossed in his meal. On the table in front of him was Kevin's huge mug, a bottle of water, and a large deep plate into which Cassandra had assembled the puffed salad from the evening before, so that it had time to soak in. The spoon sticking out from the edge was a clear indication that the dish had already been unceremoniously sampled. The child was biting into a stick of raw smoked sausage with gusto, and the woman's heart ached as the memories came flooding back. It was too painful to act rationally. For a few seconds, Cassandra even thought she was hallucinating due to overexertion or some other reason. However, the vision was too realistic in both sound and image, and even sausage-flavored. The engrossed boy broke away from his tasty pastime only after Cassandra, wheezing slightly from nervousness, caught his attention with a question. "Hello. Who are you and what are you doing here?" The boy jumped up from his chair and, without letting go of the sausage from his hand, reported, "My name is Thomas Brown. Uncle Kevin brought me here, told me to wait here for him, said I could eat whatever I wanted. So I'm eating. It's good sausage, but it's very salty." Cassandra had no idea that the man the boy called Uncle Kevin was not her husband Kevin. Such an incredible coincidence as in the film, when the hero didn't realize he had opened someone else's flat with his own keys and was completely unconcerned by anything in the typical setting of a standard flat, simply couldn't have happened. Alexandra could safely vouch that it was not easy to find even a closely similar design as in her and her husband's accommodation. Of course, the situation, with the appearance of a boy in the kitchen, must have a logical explanation, the woman thought. She herself, having married Kevin, had become Taylor, and the surname Brown meant absolutely nothing to her. Her husband was an only child with his parents, but he had cousins and cousins, as far as Cassandra knew. Except they hadn't been invited to the modest wedding, and she didn't know them not only by sight but by their last names. So it was quite possible that the Thomas Brown sitting in front of her was the child of one of her husband's cousins. But why did he, without even warning, suddenly brought this boy to their flat? Shaken out of her psychological equilibrium, Cassandra couldn't concentrate. Her thoughts were jumbled, and she didn't even have time to come up with any plausible theories before Kevin called. Coming out of her daze, Cassandra finally took the bags off her shoulders and took the call. The man began to speak quickly, literally not letting his wife get a word in edgewise. "Beloved, you and I have just missed each other by a little bit. I've just left Bridget's flat, and I'll be there in 20 minutes to explain everything to you. In the meantime, set the table, will you?" The bewildered woman cheered up a little and replied briefly, "Okay." She could feel Thomas's gaze on her very clearly, but she could not find the strength to look him in the eye. The woman brought her new slippers from the corridor, just recently bought in anticipation of the approaching summer season, and suggested, "Thomas, it's hot at home in sneakers. Keep the flip-flops. Put on more comfortable and convenient will be." The child silently obeyed. To diffuse the situation and to occupy the boy she had dropped off, but to avoid having to talk to him a lot, Cassandra asked, "Thomas, do you know how to inflate balloons?" The boy nodded. The woman quickly went to the room, brought the child a whole package, opened it. Then, on some impulse, rinsed the tips through which Thomas was to inflate the balloons and handed it to him, asking, You inflate not too much. When you get tired, rest. And I'll help you tie them. Agreed? The child nodded dutifully and, without any embarrassment, asked, "And your name, Cassandra, is it?" Cassandra shrugged her shoulders. "Yes. That's a beautiful name. Thank you." There was silence in the kitchen. The boy, thinking about something, busied himself with the balloons. Cassandra, watching her guest with a sidelong glance, began to unpack her bags, prepare what she had planned, and gradually set the table. She put the cake in the fridge, and, distracted by the thought of tying the balloons Thomas had inflated, felt a pinch of pain rather than irritation. She wasn't angry with her husband, but there were all sorts of thoughts running through her mind. The woman felt the curious gaze of the little guest, but did not dare to look him in the eye. So they looked at each other but hardly spoke to each other. Cassandra didn't notice when Kevin entered the kitchen with a huge bouquet of roses in his hands and a large bag. The man put the bag on the floor and handed the flowers to his wife. "Cassandra, congratulations to you and myself on our holiday. I see you've met Thomas and made friends? How marvelous. Well then, let's celebrate." The boy, visibly cheerful after Kevin's appearance, said modestly, "Congratulations." And as everyone sat down at the table after the inevitable fuss, he loudly boasted, "Uncle Kevin, I inflated the balloons myself and Cassandra helped me tie them. Did we give you a good surprise?" The grown man mumbled something in response to the little guest's chatter, praising Thomas and his wife, who hadn't even touched her food. There was a sense of tension in the flat, and Kevin set about remedying the situation. He turned on the music softly and began to praise his wife's cooking enthusiastically. Then he made a toast to Cassandra's beauty and charm. He took a box out of his pocket, handed it to her, and said, "Congratulations, I hope you like it." The woman, confused in her assumptions and thoughts about why her husband had brought a child into the flat, only now remembered her gift. Leaving the not-too-cheerful company for a while, Cassandra clutched the never-opened box in the palm of her hand, pulled out the hidden present. Returning to the table, she handed the bundle to her husband and confined herself to a meager phrase. "Happy tin wedding anniversary." Kevin hastily tore the wrapping paper and began to loudly admire the pewter cup and began to show the gift to Thomas. The woman felt uncomfortable and sank back into her thoughts. Not at all how she had imagined celebrating her wedding anniversary. She had wanted to prepare a surprise, but her husband had managed not just to surprise her, but to completely throw her off balance in the most natural way. Cassandra coughed violently, choking on her mineral water when she heard the question. "Cassandra, Thomas is going to stay with us for a couple of weeks, okay?" Cassandra was silent, not knowing what to say. Kevin tried to justify himself. "I went to Bridget's to pick you up on my way home and I wanted to explain everything to you. But I didn't have time, so it was a surprise. I'm sorry I didn't think to warn you, but I was sure I'd catch you at Mum's, and on the way I'd let you know we had a visitor." Kevin's monologue ended in a long silence. Cassandra moved the food on her plate with her fork without raising her eyes to her husband. He, confused, didn't know what else to say for himself. With childlike directness, Thomas broke into the silence by asking in a ringing voice, "Aunt Cassandra, thank you, I've already eaten, but can I have some cake now?" The boy showed the empty plate, and with a stony face Cassandra got up from her chair and walked to the fridge. She wanted to scream, to stomp her feet, to cry, and to hit the dishes soiled like her faith in her husband's honesty, but she knew it wouldn't make it any easier. The most likely explanation for Kevin bringing Thomas to the flat seemed to her to be his cheating husband. With her whole being, Cassandra now hated the man she had loved for 10 years as much as she knew how. Kevin, who knew his wife well, guessed from her jerky movements that she would say everything she had on her mind, and decided to take the little guest away from the table to a sitting area where he could distract himself from the upcoming serious conversation between the adults. "Thomas, come on. I'll switch on the games console. I have mostly complicated games, but we can find something to your taste on the internet. Or I'll switch on cartoons if you want." "Will you be able to eat cake there?" the boy asked interestedly. "Of course, everything is possible there." The boy's eyes sparkled, and he trustingly followed the owner of the flat to a cozy, soft corner. Cassandra, having heard her husband and guest talking, cut off a large piece of cake, carefully placed it on a plate, switched on the electric kettle and carefully watched it boil. The click of the switch being switched off brought her out of her reverie. Making the tea, the woman placed a cup of the tasty drink, sugar and spoon, and a plate of cake on a tray, and then took it to the table near the play area of the flat. Kevin was showing Thomas a collection of computer games, but the boy, who was clearly well-mannered, broke away from the fascinating activity and thanked her. "Thank you very much." The woman nodded and, turning abruptly, walked away. When Kevin walked into the kitchen, he found a strange sight. Cassandra sitting on the floor, holding a dirty-looking pair of children's sneakers, tears rolling down her cheeks. The man tried to make a joke. "Cassandra, come on." A child with dirty shoes walked into the kitchen. "We'll switch on the Hoover robot and let it work. It's not a big deal. Is it worth getting upset over a little dust? Especially since it was a holiday." Cassandra looked at her husband in a way that made him uncomfortable and said quietly, "Kevin, I think I've told you repeatedly that I don't want to be in the same space with the children for too long. It's beyond me. I guess your action, or as you put it, your surprise, had good reasons, and I can understand that. But I'm sorry, Beck. I don't have the slightest desire to deal with the proceedings today. I'm going to go to my mum's and stay with her for a while." Kevin could not understand the reason for his wife's categorical decision, but he could see that Cassandra was on the verge of a nervous breakdown, so he proposed. "Cassandra, I'm really guilty for not warning you, but I can explain. I think that when you hear me out, you'll realize that I just couldn't have done it any other way. I'll wait until you're ready to talk." The woman suddenly gently lowered the children's sneakers to the floor, wiped the tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and walked to the door as if she hadn't heard her husband. Kevin took his wife's hand and asked, "Cassandra, wait a minute. I'll call a taxi to Bridget's house, so I don't have to worry about you." Cassandra nodded and was soon in the car, fumbling with the strap of her purse. The road was clear, and the journey to her mother's house took much less time than it did during peak hours. Hardly had the woman opened the door when she heard it. "Maggie, come in, dear. I'm not feeling very well." Cassandra closed the door behind her and took off her shoes and walked into her mum's bedroom. Bridget became alarmed when she saw her daughter. "Cassandrachka, why are you back? Didn't Kevin come home? I reckon your wedding anniversary should be in full swing and you're here for some reason. Daughter, what's wrong?" Cassandra walked over to her mother's bed, sat down on the floor, and leaned her head on Bridget's palm and recounted everything that had happened since she had come home and seen Thomas there. When she had finished, Cassandra made a suggestion. "Mum, I'm pretty sure Thomas is Kevin's illegitimate son. The boy looks to be about 6 years old, which means my husband has been giving me the horns and has the nerve to show me evidence of his infidelity on our wedding anniversary." Bridget tried to reassure her daughter. "I'm sure Kevin can explain everything. I feel he loves you. Trust my experience. He would hardly risk his relationship with you and cheat." However, Cassandra cried without stopping. The woman stroked her so grown-up but defenseless sobbing girl, but did not utter any more words because they were all powerless. Finally, when the flow of tears had dried up, Cassandra silently got up from the floor and went to wash her face swollen with tears. The woman felt completely devastated. Returning to her mother's room, Cassandra confessed, "I'm very tired for today, and do you mind if I lie down?" Bridget did not object and suggested, for example, that we talk some more and have dinner. She realized that her unfortunate daughter needed to rest. "Of course, Cassandrachka, but why don't you and I have a sedative, at least some valerian? It would do you and me good." Cassandra complied with her mother's request and went to bed. The nervous tension was so intense that the woman passed out and woke up when it was 10 o'clock in the morning. Jumping up on the couch, Cassandra rushed to the kitchen, where she found her mother stirring the batter for pancakes. "Good morning, daughter. You're just in time for breakfast." The women cooked the pancakes in 4 hands and, as if in agreement, never said a word about yesterday's situation. As Cassandra washed the dishes, Bridget asked, "Daughter, please go to the theater with Maggie. She has 2 tickets to a very good play, great seats. Her niece gave them to her for her birthday. They were supposed to go together, but as luck would have it, her niece got sick. The rest of the family can't keep Maggie company. Someone's got a holiday cottage, someone's traveling on a business trip. All in all, it's a shame to lose the ticket." Cassandra shook her head. "Mum, I don't want to go anywhere I'm not in the mood." But if Bridget had something on her mind, she knew how to insist. "That's why you should go, because you're not in the mood. Art is great at shifting thoughts in your head and changing your emotions. Please, daughter, not for the sake of the missing ticket, but for me." Reluctantly, Cassandra had to comply with her mum's wish. However, she refused the offer to run to the hairdressers beforehand and get a new haircut. After waiting for Maggie to take Cassandra away, Bridget called her son-in-law and said in an almost commanding tone, "Kevin, Cassandra will be gone for about 3 hours. Come over. We need to talk." The man did not resist, but warned, "Bridget, I'll definitely come. But I don't have anyone to leave Thomas with. I can probably find a nanny, but I wouldn't trust the boy to someone I don't know, so I can only come with him. Do you mind?" The woman sighed. "I don't mind." "Good. Then I'll be at your place with Thomas in half an hour." 30 minutes later, Bridget carefully reached the door, leaning on a steady walker, and let Kevin and Thomas into the flat. The man introduced the child, and the boy said hello politely. The landlady tried not to show her incredible excitement and invited Thomas into the kitchen. "Come in, I have a TV and cakes waiting for you. Do you want cocoa or tea?" The child announced that coffee was the most delicious for him, but that children should not drink this drink often, and he would have tea, because he was too old for cocoa. Bridget almost laughed out of surprise, but she got her emotions under control in time and, turning to Kevin, asked, "Can I give Thomas a chicory drink then? It's almost like coffee." The boy got excited. "I want to try this chicory, Uncle Kevin, can I?" Kevin agreed, and when the hostess had cleverly prepared the treat for Thomas, the man handed the boy his smartphone and explained, "I need to have a chat with Bridget. You please stay here. Eat the treats, play on your phone, maybe even watch some clips on the internet for a bit, okay?" "Sure, Uncle Kevin. I'm perfectly capable of unsupervised. Don't worry." Watching this picture, Bridget could hardly contain herself from crying and hiding her emotions. She slowly began to walk towards the room, which was called the hall in the old-fashioned way. She was followed by Kevin, who was eager to find out what Bridget wanted to talk to him about. The woman sat down in the armchair, and the man sat on the sofa across from it, so that the conversation could be carried on comfortably. The hostess looked at her son-in-law attentively, but he did not bear it for long and asked without preamble, "Bridget, can you explain to me why Cassandra reacted so inappropriately to Thomas's appearance in our flat? I admit it was my fault for not warning her, but we're adults. Instead of having a calm conversation, she basically just ran to you. Is that normal?" The woman did not interrupt her son-in-law's indignant speech, but she did not hurry to answer his question, but asked a counter-question. "Before I start a difficult conversation to try to help my daughter keep her family together, I need to be sure it makes sense. Tell me honestly, is Thomas your illegitimate son?" The man's outrage was unparalleled. "No, of course I'd never think of cheating on Cassandra. I love her very much, I respect her, but her attitude towards children is beginning to frighten me. Thomas ended up in our flat because of a desperate situation, but Cassandra didn't even try to get along with him. Although, as you may have noticed, he is a well-mannered, bright, and charming boy." Kevin's answer calmed the worried woman, and taking a deep breath as if preparing to parachute in, she decided to tell her son-in-law the truth. "Well, all things secret, as they say, come to light. As a husband, you have the right to know why my daughter avoids contact with my children. I think I have the right to tell you her story, which at first seemed like a happy fairy tale, and then turned into a terrible nightmare that destroyed the usual life. Cassandra grew up to be a marvelous and clever girl, a real joy to me and my husband. We had no trouble getting her into one of the best grammar schools in our city. The wealth of our family and the positions held by me and my husband allowed Cassandra to be her own among the same, as they say, the golden youth. However, the gymnasium had a very strong teaching staff and grades were not for sale, as you might think. Children were skillfully interested in learning, and our Cassandrachka was one of the best students in the class. She was even sort of made a mentor for her desk mate Michael. The boy was from a very good family, quite influential in our town. Just kidding, his dad is a regional prosecutor. His mom is in the same department, not on the last position. In general, they were better off than our family, but they did not hinder the development of friendship between their son and Cassandra. They sincerely welcomed her, and they did not talk to me and my husband through the lip, but quite kindly. When Cassandra was in year 10, her father died suddenly. A blood clot had broken off, as the autopsy showed. It was Michael's family that supported me and Cassandra after this loss. I still thank them for that, because I was in such a state that I almost went to my husband. So of course I didn't mind at all when Cassandra decided to marry Michael. So what if they were just over 18 at the time? Obviously you can't stand in the way of real feelings. Michael's parents didn't mind either, and were even happy that my daughter was part of their family. A year after the wedding, Cassandra and Michael had twins and 2 boys, Stephen and Marcus. Healthy, happy, strong. They grew up and made us all happy. Cassandra couldn't get enough of her babies. You know, Kevin, she used to tell me that she was walking, rolling the pram in front of her, and her heart would jump out of her chest from happiness. Of course, I helped whenever I could. My husband's mom repeatedly suggested that Cassandra hire a reliable nanny, but my daughter refused every time, and she mostly managed on her own. God knows what it cost her, but she didn't give up her university studies, and even managed to manage without a sabbatical. And her husband's father got her a prestigious and well-paid job, a position where the working day was strictly rationed, and there was a social package and other niceties. He had the opportunity, of course, and he was not ashamed to patronize his daughter-in-law. Cassandrachka was a clever girl. Stephen and Marcus were 6 years old when my daughter became pregnant again. Michael welcomed the news with joy, and there was nothing to be sad about. The family had a wonderful relationship. As far as I knew, there had never been a fight between them. It was as if the 2 halves were lucky enough to be united as one. I know a lot of people were jealous, and some ladies tried to have an affair with Michael, but he didn't want anyone but my Cassandrachka. Everything was so perfect that I didn't even think that everything would fall apart overnight because of a terrible tragedy. Cassandrachka had to go to the doctor, and Michael volunteered to pick up his sons from kindergarten. Ridiculously, his car broke down that day, so he decided not to call a taxi, but to take the children home through the park. The weather was fine, and although the rides were not yet open, there was a pizzeria at the exit of the park that the boys wanted to go to. Michael met a mate on the way, and while he was talking to him, the kids got excited and ran out onto the lake, but the marsh ice was treacherously thin. My grandchildren, as witnesses told me later, did not even have time to shout. They went under the water in a flash. Michael and his mate rushed to the pond, but there was no way to catch the boys, managed only to arrive at the scene of the tragedy divers. Michael later tried to justify himself as wound up, constantly repeating that he was distracted only for a few seconds, but what good? Our boys had drowned, and it could not be undone. My son-in-law was the first to tell me this bitter news, because he was afraid for Cassandra, and for good reason. I went to the private clinic where I knew Cassandrachka was at that time. My heart told me that it was better to have doctors close by when the worst of grief came upon my daughter. Seeing me in the corridor, Cassandra must have realized everything from my face. She had been hysterical since the news of what had happened. Even a large dose of medication could not calm Cassandra down. She never made it home that night, ending up in hospital with a nervous breakdown. Because of her worries about her dead sons, my daughter was unable to save the baby that was developing under her heart. He wasn't even considered a baby by the doctors. She had already lost him. At the funeral of Stephen and Marcus, Cassandra stood like a stone statue, no tears, no emotion, pale as death. Especially terrible was the emptiness in her eyes. Michael was no less worried. Having turned gray in his 25 years, he tried to take Cassandra's hand for support, but she shied away from him like a leper. She never again crossed the threshold of the flat where she lived with her husband and sons. How many times Michael had tried to talk to her could not be counted, but it had never worked. Cassandra just cut her husband out of her life. Michael's mother came to us. Having realized that my daughter did not want to see or hear from her husband, she was on her knees, begging me to forgive her son, saying that he was not like himself. She shared her sad thoughts that he was on the verge of leaving this world, but Cassandra did not react. She had never forgiven her husband for the loss of her sons. Michael could not forgive himself either. Indeed, he had turned from a blossoming man into a pale semblance of his former self. Cassandra predictably quit her job, seemingly of her own volition, but in fact everyone realized that she simply could not be under public scrutiny. In addition, there was an unusual and unexpected problem. Her daughter was approaching hysterics. It was worth it to go outside and see the child. She changed her route, but it was impossible to absolutely eliminate the possibility of meeting children. One day, Cassandra and I were riding in the lift, and a neighbor with a baby came in with us. Everything seemed to be normal, but I rejoiced too early. After the traveling companion got out of the lift, I looked at my daughter and saw that her chin was bleeding. She had bitten her lip so hard trying to hold back a tantrum. After this incident, my daughter stayed at home all day and night for almost a month. I even called a special doctor, the best of the best, at home. There were changes, but not quick and not at all positive. After a period of apathy, my daughter became aggressive. It was as if she had an obsession, and the medication prescribed by the doctor could not cope with it for long. Cassandra would take the pills for a few hours, fall into a state of indifference to everything, then begin to think about something painfully, walking from side to side in the room. One day I saw that she was looking for poison options online, and I was seriously frightened. I realized that my daughter had decided to deal with the unwitting perpetrator of her children's deaths. I tried to stay close to my daughter at all times to make sure she didn't do anything irreparable. Once, Cassandra managed to leave the house in the morning while I was asleep. People told me later that she caught Michael at his work and attacked him with her fists. She was screaming, why do you live and our sons don't?" I don't know, maybe my acquaintances exaggerated, but supposedly 4 strong men could barely pull her away from the confused Michael. He didn't even resist. When I came to pick her up, my daughter was sitting in the back room, where there was the aroma of the hated sedative and some other drugs, and almost did not react to anything. I was told that an ambulance had come and sedated Cassandra. Among my acquaintances and neighbors, of course, there was only talk of my grandchildren's accident and Cassandra going mad with grief. One day, Michael's father called me and urged me to leave town with his daughter. You don't say no to people like him. Besides, I'd been thinking of ways to hide my daughter from sympathetic and prying eyes. I quit my job, sold my flat. Again, thanks to my son-in-law's parents, I managed to do it both quickly and at a price that was quite adequate, given the urgency. Cassandra and Michael were divorced in absentia. Again, thanks to his relatives. My daughter didn't even have to go anywhere. We ended up moving to this town, away from everything that was, and then you know the rest, Kevin. You met her, and my daughter started coming back to life. Don't get me wrong, Cassandra's not bad with kids. She's just still in pain. She refuses to be a mom again for fear of repeating the nightmare she went through. Bridget was silent as she recounted her daughter's terrible story. The woman was exhausted mentally. Kevin noticed how pale her face had become and hurried to the kitchen to fetch her some water. Thomas was playing on his phone, and the man stroked his head, filled a glass, and returned to Bridget in the hall. "I'm sorry to make you remember everything." The woman took a careful drink of her water and spoke bitterly. Kevin, if only it could be forgotten at all. I probably should have told you about Cassandra's past sooner, but I've been hesitant to say it out loud. My daughter, I understand, still can't talk about it either. The man looked at the woman, puzzled, and confessed. To be honest, I had no idea that Cassandra's reluctance to become a mum could hide such a tragedy. I thought she probably didn't want to ruin her figure. I can't imagine how she must have felt when she saw Thomas in our kitchen. What a surprise I managed to surprise her on our anniversary. How am I supposed to apologize to Cassandra and make her understand? I really had nowhere to bring Thomas, and for a number of reasons. The boy needed to stay for a week or two in a safe and comfortable place where his parents' enemies wouldn't think to look. I arrived at the branch and bumped into an old mate I hadn't seen since the demobilization. Winston was more than a friend to me. It was thanks to him that I survived the army, but that's a long story. In the civilian life, we were separated by our hometowns, and as it happens, our contacts were lost. I tried to find him on social networks, but without success. Perhaps I should have been more persistent in my search, then I would have found him. But I was building my career. Anyway, I haven't seen him for 15 years, and now I'm meeting Winston in a city that's foreign to both of us. Of course, he had changed over the years, but I recognized him at once. He almost walked past me without noticing, but I stopped him. It turned out that Winston had come to solve the problems of his sister and her husband. They were involved in a lawsuit with not two adequate people who used to conduct all affairs in a criminal way. Winston was most worried about Thomas, his nephew. He explained to his sister that the child should be hidden just in case, because through him these bandits could easily influence the decision of the issue in their favor, but they could not think of any safe place. And then I come out of nowhere. To Winston, the idea of getting Thomas out of town seemed the ideal. In fact, there were virtually no strings that could put the bandits on the child's trail. It was good that the boy had a strong character, a real man growing up. His parents and Winston told him he had to stay with me for a while, and he took the news in stride. I picked him up like a detective so I wouldn't get caught on the city's security cameras. We agreed to contact Winston in a week, and he should call me when the matter was resolved. Thomas, of course, is a perfect boy. He got used to being in an unfamiliar place. He even went to bed by himself after brushing his teeth. All we have to do is wait for Winston to call. Thomas is very easy for me to talk to, but I have to go to work on Monday and I can hardly take him with me. I don't know what to do now. Kevin was silent, and then Cassandra's voice came out of the blue. It's no big deal. You go to work as usual and I'll stay with Thomas. Just leave me the car so I don't have to take public transport to get to and from Mom. It turned out that, contrary to Bridget's calculations, her daughter had already returned from the theater and seemed to have heard some part of her husband's story. Preempting her mother's question, Cassandra explained. I couldn't watch the play in the theater. I went to the bathroom, washed my face, and realized I couldn't go back and look at the stage without even trying to get into the story. So I typed Maggie an apology and came here. Turns out I got back just in time. I guess I should have heard Thomas's story from the outside, because Kevin, I'm sorry I suspected you of cheating and I wouldn't have believed you if you'd told me all that yesterday. I can see the situation more clearly today. Mom, you don't mind if I visit you with Thomas, do you? The woman, trying not to frighten away the change in her daughter's attitude towards her children, spoke very carefully. Of course you can come. Bridget wanted to say something else, but her eyes were watering, and she decided to change the subject. Cassandrachka, Kevin, aren't you hungry? I could eat something right now. Let's go into the kitchen. All the more reason to see how Thomas is doing, see if he's bored. I've forgotten all about the rules of hospitality. The boy saw Cassandra and said hello, and the woman's voice trembled slightly as she responded to his greeting. Kevin, who had understood the reason for his wife's strange behavior, was now amazed at her resilience. She had been through such an ordeal and had never tried to appeal to his pity or to elicit sympathy with stories of what she had faced. Cassandra gently but insistently dismissed Bridget's attempts to feed everyone gathered in her kitchen that evening. Thank you, Mum, for everything, but we'll probably go home. I'll stop by tomorrow close to lunchtime. Kevin, who realized he had received his wife's forgiveness, was overjoyed and bid Bridget a heartfelt farewell, promising, "We'll all visit you all together tomorrow. If your health permits and the weather is warm, we can go out into the countryside. How would you like that, Bridget?" Wonderful, Kevin, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. After saying goodbye to Cassandra's landlady, Kevin and Thomas went to the other side of town. The man sat behind the wheel and watched in the mirror as his wife carefully fastened the boy's seatbelt. It was obvious that for Cassandra it was a completely natural gesture, once perfected to the point of automaticity. She was obviously a caring mother. She loved her children very much, and after her misfortune she was suffering in a way that her worst enemy could not wish for. Carefully parked the car at the entrance. The man carried the sleeping Thomas in his arms to the flat. Cassandra straightened out the rumpled sheet on the couch, carefully removed the boy's shoes, and covered the child with a blanket. Watching his wife, Kevin felt incredible tenderness for her. Suddenly, the woman he loved opened up to him from an unfamiliar side of her personality. and he realized that he had made the absolutely right choice. Later, with the door to the kitchen closed, they drank tea with the remaining cake, and it was as if there had been no wall of misunderstanding between them yesterday. With jokes and kisses, they planned the schedule for Sunday afternoon. The man dared to bring up the unpleasant subject and confessed. "Cassandra, I am a real idiot. I almost ruined everything with my act, and I want to say thank you very much for your understanding." The wife smiled. "Well, I, to be honest, also overreacted, so I propose to forget bygones." The weekend went cheerfully and even better than the spouses had anticipated. They'd managed to get Bridget out for a walk, too, and she'd been much less happy about the sunny May day than she'd been about her daughter's happy eyes. Cassandra was happy to answer Thomas's questions and also kept a constant eye on him to make sure he wasn't in danger. Neither her mother nor her husband dared reprimand her for being overprotective. Thomas didn't seem to care that he was surrounded by the utmost care. By agreement with Cassandra, he called her by her first name without using the word aunt and seemed quite content with his unexpected journey. When they had brought Bridget home after the entertainment, the trio had to wait, for there was no chance of leaving the woman without being fed. No one minded, though. Late that night, as Cassandra was putting Thomas to bed, the boy quietly asked her, "Do you think my parents are doing well? Will I be able to see them soon?" Trying to keep her voice firm and convincing, Cassandra replied, "Of course they are doing well. Very soon they will do all their business, and you will meet them." The boy fell asleep. Cassandra, afraid of waking the child, beckoned her husband into the kitchen and began to ask him about the story Thomas's parents were involved in. "Cassandra, I honestly don't even know all the details. Winston gave me a very brief outline, but I realized that his sister and her husband had been attacked by some really bad guys." The woman began to clarify, asking unexpected questions for her husband. "Are these bandits from the city where you went, or are they newcomers? Did your friend give you any nicknames?" Kevin told everything he knew, but Cassandra didn't have enough information and suddenly asked, "Can you get in touch with Winston in an emergency? I need some clarification from him to try and help Thomas' parents. Of course he's doing well and quite comfortable with us, I hope, but it shouldn't be that mom and son are separated for too long." From Cassandra's voice, it was impossible to guess how close she had taken Thomas and his parents' situation to heart. But now, knowing about his wife's past, Kevin realized how difficult it was for her. "Winston actually gave me a password to a chat room where all messages are automatically burnt. I think we can try to contact him." The man opened the necessary site, entered the data he had learnt by heart at the request of his army friend, and after a few minutes he exclaimed with joy, "It worked, Winston, you've greeted me." Cassandra thoughtfully advised, "Kevin, ask him a question, by the answer to which you can tell for sure whether your friend is talking to you or not. And if there is even the slightest doubt, immediately close the site and take the phone card out of your phone." Alarmed by his wife's suspicions, Kevin quickly typed a few phrases and eagerly awaited the reply. After reading the message he received, the man exhaled in relief. "All is well, that's for sure, Winston," he replied with our code phrase. Cassandra nodded and asked, "Great, text Winston that your wife will be texting him now and give me the phone number. I'll find out from your friend what I need to know." No longer surprised, Kevin handed the smartphone to his wife. She texted with someone she didn't know for quite a while. Then she grabbed a pen, quickly wrote a number on a bread wrapper, tore off a piece of paper with numbers, clutched it in her hand, and handed the phone to her husband. "I'm going to the bathroom. I need to make a call. Text Winston to come to this chat room in an hour. Then hopefully I can give him something concrete." Cassandra walked out of the kitchen and into the bathroom, which had the best noise insulation in the flat. Taking a few deep breaths, the woman dialed her ex-husband's father's memorized number. The phone was unavailable. Cassandra summoned all her willpower and dialed her ex-husband's number. Soon his voice came through the receiver. "I'm listening. Don't be silent." Cassandra's voice became hoarse with excitement, and she answered, "Michael, hello, it's Cassandra. I need your help. Or rather, I think your dad can solve the situation, but I can't reach him. The robot says the phone is out of range." The man's demanding tone softened considerably. "Cassandra, it's good to hear from you. My father is overseas, but if you tell me what the problem is, I'll do my best to help. I work in the district attorney's office now, so all my connections are at your service." "Thank you," the woman replied. She told me everything she'd learned and dictated the number she'd written down. "Okay, Cassandra, I get it. It's not a simple matter, but it's solvable. I think after all, for every scumbag there is a more powerful force. I'll try to help, but tell this friend of mine that I'll call him tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, depending on how things turn out, from his phone, and he can take the call." "Thank you, Michael." Without waiting for her ex-husband's retort, Cassandra ended the conversation, which had been very difficult for her, and washed her face with ice water, hoping it would bring her at least a semblance of composure. Still in the process of talking to Michael, she wanted to apologize to him, but she couldn't. The bitter resentment at the man's inattention that had caused her to lose her children still stung the woman's heart. At the same time, Cassandra realized that without the intervention of her ex-husband, who had extensive connections in the area, Thomas's family was practically doomed, and she wanted to keep the boy safe and try to save his parents. For a while, the woman sat in the bathroom, leveling her heartbeat with breathing exercises. Seeing that an hour had practically passed, she returned to Kevin in the kitchen and informed him of what Michael had said. The man texted his friend the information he had received from his wife and hugged Cassandra tightly. He could see how the woman he loved had shrunk in the last hour, and he didn't know how to help her. He wanted to protect her from all adversity. Instead, Cassandra had to turn, as Kevin easily guessed, to the man who had almost destroyed her fate to the ground. The conversation stirred the woman. She released herself from Kevin's embrace and automatically began clearing the table, oblivious to the fact that she was sending her husband's completely untouched food into the bin. Finally, the man intercepted her hand and suggested, "Drop this fuss. It's been a difficult day and we need to rest." Even as she listened to her sleeping husband's measured breathing, Cassandra could not calm down. The images of her babies came to her eyes as if they were real. Stephen and Marcus smiling toothless smiles at her. Then they were going to kindergarten for the first time and leaning against the window, waving their little hands at her. They hand her holiday cards. Here, obviously conspiring, instead of falling asleep, they applaud loudly and unanimously when she begins to sing them a lullaby. How many pleasant moments there had been, so carefully stored, somewhere far away in her memory, and so rudely had everything been crossed out by an accident. How many times she had warned her sons not to take risks, and still they had not listened. What was the use of being angry now, though? Stephen and Marcus are gone. Their father is now the only hope for Thomas to get a hug from his mom in the very near future. At least let this woman, a complete stranger to Cassandra, be able to help Michael. Thomas began to murmur something, and Cassandra slipped out from under her husband's arm and hurried to the boy. She gently adjusted the blanket he had almost thrown on the floor, felt his forehead, fearing he was running a fever, and sighed in relief as she realized that, in her experience, all was well. Thomas opened his eyes and Cassandra sat down on the edge of the sofa and began to hum softly a lullaby. The boy had long since fallen asleep, but the woman remained seated beside him. She was so anxious for the child to return to his parents, and at the same time, she realized that she would desperately miss spending time with him. As the sky, visible through the slit between the curtains, lightened, Cassandra went quietly to the kitchen to make herself some coffee and work on her paperwork, because there was no point in going to bed. In these dawn hours, there might be matters directly affecting Thomas' fate being decided somewhere far away, but Cassandra was powerless to influence anything. She had already done everything she could to overcome her mortal resentment, and now all she had to do was wait for the outcome. After carefully studying the papers, the woman made notes in the margins on a separate sheet of paper, wrote out her suggestions, and carefully tucking them all away in a zipped folder, began to prepare breakfast, trying not to make any noise. She had already decided to ask her boss to excuse her, so as not to tire the boy too much by traveling to unfamiliar places. After waiting for the time to send messages, Cassandra typed to the boss that she would pass the prepared documents through her husband and began to think of something to please the little guest, who of course was worried about the forced separation from his parents, although he tried to keep up his good behavior. When Kevin, who had showered but was still yawning, came into the kitchen, Cassandra had almost everything ready. She invited her husband to the table and asked, "Kevin, stop by on your way to Mr. Jasper's and give him the file for me. I've already warned him that I won't be able to stop by work for a few days, and if there's anything that needs to be reviewed, have him email it to me or pass it on through you. As a last resort, of course, I'll drive up, but I don't want to stress Thomas out. I wanted to go to my mother's house with him and then go to the Children's Entertainment Center so he could have fun playing on the computer, so he wouldn't think about sad things because he was having nightmares at night." Kevin agreed to his wife's plan, and after quickly swallowing his breakfast, he thanked her and started to get ready for work. Thomas woke up much later, but Cassandra had no thought of waking him up. She wanted the boy to be comfortable. The woman fed the child and then suggested, "Let's stop by my mom's for a bit, and then we'll go somewhere to rest." A text message arrived on Cassandra's phone, and she smiled when she saw the notification that the money had been credited. Kevin had worried about his wife not having any financial problems. The woman smiled and asked the boy, "Would you like me and you to go to an amusement park? It's not too far from the city, and there are lots of fun things to do there: a laughing room, rope courses, and I think even a climbing wall. Do you like that kind of active entertainment, or maybe you prefer the cinema? That's no problem either. I haven't watched a film on the big screen in 100 years. Thomas confessed embarrassedly, "I'd rather go to an amusement park, to be honest." "Well, that's where we're going." Bridget was delighted when her daughter came to see her with the boy. It meant Cassandra believed her husband and didn't rush out and demand the child be placed somewhere because of traumatic memories. She could see that Cassandra seemed to thaw out, even after her brief interaction with Thomas, and barely made them leave as soon as possible. "Daughter, I'm feeling just fine today. Go have fun. If anything, of course, I'll call you, and don't worry at all, really. It's like I even have more energy today after yesterday's walk." Turning to the boy, Bridget asked, "Thomas, I beg you, rest well for you and me." The boy nodded quite seriously and promised, "I'll have Cassandra take pictures and send them to you. You have a state-of-the-art smartphone, don't you?" The woman smiled and praised. "Well done. Great idea. That's right. I'm going to have fun with you. Cassandra, check your phone is charged." Cassandra reassured her mum by saying that she could charge her phone in the car at any time. Soon the guests left Bridget, and she was left alone to dream that her daughter would finally decide to become a mum again. It was obvious to her that Cassandra had a great way with children, but she had suffered for so many years, deliberately avoiding contact with them. "May everything turn out well for my suffering little girl." Bridget prayed aloud, hoping that the plea would be heard upstairs. Cassandra, driving with particular care, drove Thomas out for fun and felt the weight of her willingly assumed responsibility growing on her. The boy had first of all asked to go on the ropes course, and the woman had agreed. Though at the sight of the rope stretched high, she wanted to grab the child in her arms and not let go. Cassandra watched the frolicking child and from time to time took photos, but did not dare to distract herself from sending particularly expressive pictures to her mother. It seemed to her that if she distracted herself for even a few seconds, something bad would happen to the boy. The thought crossed her mind of the degree of desperation Thomas's mum had been in, agreeing to give her son to a near stranger. Such an act could only be dared because of the real threat to the child's life and health. So she, Cassandra, had no right to let down a woman about whom she knew the bare minimum of information: name, surname, age, and the fact that the unfortunate woman and her husband were involved in a story that she could not get out of on her own. Cassandra, however, was in an even more advantageous position. Cheryl, Thomas's mum, knew less about the people who had taken her son in. The fun-filled Monday had flashed by without a second thought. The boy, tired from his many outdoor activities, fell asleep after a hearty dinner and rested peacefully until morning without crying out or waking up. Kevin and Cassandra chatted quietly in the kitchen. The woman spoke enthusiastically about how bravely Thomas had conquered the rides and showed pictures. "Tomorrow I want to take our guest to our museums after his visit to his mother, and then to the cinema or vice versa, as Thomas wants. If you can, come along, it'll be fun. He's so funny and sometimes he has such deep thoughts." He told me today that adults try to look serious on purpose to be feared and not to be picked on. Can you imagine? The man agreed that there was something reasonable in this inference and suggested, "Cassandra, let's go to bed too, like Thomas, because tomorrow, as I understand it, will be no less busy." Neither Tuesday nor Wednesday brought news from Michael or the boy's relatives. Although the child attended all kinds of entertaining and educational establishments, his mood was getting worse every day. He became increasingly brooding and sad. Kevin and Cassandra realized that the boy was missing his family more and more, but had no influence on the situation. It wasn't until Thursday, when Cassandra and Thomas were visiting Bridget, that the long-awaited phone call came. Michael informed his ex-wife that the main difficulties were over and warned her. "There are still a few things to be resolved, but that's the small stuff. The important thing is that the boy is now safe. His parents are on their way to the town where you live now. I warned them to call you in advance, as they will arrive and clarify the address. Anyway, I'll see this thing through to the final point, of course, so don't worry." Cassandra thanked her ex-husband profusely. "Thank you, Michael, and I'm sorry for everything." The man's voice was ringing as he replied to the woman he had hurt so much. "Cassandra, you have no idea how glad I am to hear from you, even if it is on such an occasion. I wish you happiness, and if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. I'm always happy to help." Cassandra said goodbye to her ex-husband and Bridget, who had heard her daughter's conversation, couldn't believe her own ears. It seemed her Cassandra had just spoken quite adequately to a man she had once loved dearly and then hated. "Mom, we have to leave. Thomas's parents are on their way and I have to give him a bath." The child realized that he would soon see his mom and dad and started jumping around the room shouting, "Yay!" Cassandra barely managed to keep him quiet. Bridget, happy that the situation had been resolved, gave the boy a souvenir of her photograph in the stamp collection he liked so much. "Here, Thomas, you will look at the album and remember me." The child promised. "Thank you, but I won't forget you, Grandma Bridget, even without stamps." Seizing the moment, Cassandra called her husband to tell him the good news, but it turned out he already knew. "Cassandra, Winston has already told me that thanks to your help, everything has been resolved. I'm taking a taxi home now to get ready for the guests." Cassandra was a little sad to part with the boy who had awakened in her memories of the most joyful days in the company of her sons, and she invited him to visit the toy shop on the way. "You know, I'd really like to get you something too. Choose whatever you want." The boy did not resist, but apparently shy, did not walk for a long time between the racks of toys on display, and soon he took a robot from the shelf, which was not the most expensive. On the way to the checkout, Cassandra put in her basket the aeroplane Thomas had once told her about, and a few more board games. "Oh, there's so much," said the child in surprise. "What a treat today." Cassandra agreed. "Yes, Thomas, it is a very big holiday today." By the time the doorbell rang, the boy was already cleanly bathed, and the cutlery was flaunting on the table. Cheryl, barely over the threshold, rushed to her son, hugging him and showering him with kisses. The boy's father handed Cassandra flowers, and Winston gave Kevin a firm, manly hug. After Thomas, assuming the role of an adult, introduced the parents to the owners of the flat, everyone sat down at the table. Cheryl volunteered to help Cassandra and confessed, "If it weren't for your kindness, I don't know how we would have managed. I don't know how to express my gratitude. My husband and I have raised money to cover the cost of Thomas and your inconvenience." Cassandra turned pale and replied, "Cheryl, put that envelope away immediately. Don't insult me with this act. You have a boy who will be going to school soon, so spend this money on him. And, if you don't mind, send me and my husband a picture of him once in a while. That would be the best thanks." An embarrassed Cheryl burst into tears and hugged Cassandra. When Thomas, concerned about Mum and Cassandra's long absence from the table, peeked into the kitchen, he saw the women roaring, unable to hold back their tears, and began to ask in a mature manner, "What happened? Did you bump, cut, burn?" Cassandra and Cheryl synchronously wiped away their tears. Mom reassured her son. "It's okay, honey. Everything is just fine." Hugging the boy, she picked him up, lifted him up and spun him around. Cassandra watched the happy people and did not feel envy, but wished that this family had all their troubles in the past. After the guests left, Cassandra trustingly snuggled up to her husband and confessed to him. "You know, I think I'm ready for motherhood. Thomas proved to me that children are the greatest happiness." The man did not change his wife's mind. Soon Cassandra pleased him and Bridget with the news of her pregnancy. Exactly on time and without any complications, the woman gave birth to a daughter. The girl was named Veronica, as a symbol of victory over the terrible situation that had happened to the sister of Kevin's army friend, and victory over the terrible memories of the past. Amber considered herself as much a part of these places as the dry air that smelled of wormwood, or the huge stones that broke through from the walls of an ancient fortress. Where else? On these stones. She'd been born here, true, not really, but closer to the sea. But their family had moved to this small town when Amber had just started walking. And in 18 years, the girl had become flesh of his flesh. It was a purely female family. No, of course, her grandmother had once had a husband, but Amber no longer remembered her grandfather. He had died long ago, before she was born. She had a father, too. And he was the one she remembered, and she loved him very much. But he couldn't find a job that would allow his family to live in relative poverty. So he took a job as a shift worker, flying across the country every month, far beyond the Rocky Mountains. Mom began patching holes after years of being broke. The family needed everything from new bedding to replace dilapidated ones to coats and boots for growing Amber. Dad loved the West. He told stories of bright summer nights casting tin, of funny coyotes, of moss falling underfoot in the swamps when he went huckleberry picking. But Dad had not only found his place in life, he'd also found a soulmate, someone named Lauren, who worked for him as a cook. He never came back with Lauren. Lauren had her own apartment in Sacramento, and out west, they were given a room in a dormitory for shift workers. Her father continued to send money for Amber, probably most of his Western earnings. Amber didn't want to touch them. Some call it adolescent maximalism, others call it the kind of mental purity that only comes from youth. Amber demanded the transfers be sent back. She didn't want to be tied to this man from the moment he cheated until the end of her days. The blow was stronger, for she was very attached to her father. The only daughter, used to thinking she was the most favorite. Her mother was lost, looking from Amber to her grandmother for guidance. If Amber wanted to mentally picture her mom, the first thing that came to mind was her always scared and unsure look. "You don't want the money, don't take it. You're right," Grandma said calmly, and made a sign to her daughter. "Temmie, leave her alone." "I know it's going to be hard on Mom." Amber knew what her family was thinking. "I'm going to work. There are different ways to live. Better, worse," Grandma said. "We'll adjust. But remember about Mom, she has poor health." When the women were alone, Grandma told her daughter, "Make an account in Amber's name and put the money in that account. We'll get by somehow. The girl's conscience will be clear. If she wants to someday, and will return to his father every penny, and you can safely look into the eyes of John." Sometimes husbands tell their ex-wives they're living off their alimony. And if, God forbid, I die, that money will come in handy for Amber when she's an adult. Amber didn't know about the second part of the plan and stoically accepted the fact that their little family had the bare necessities. Her mom worked at the library, and she loved books so much that she sometimes brought them back from the dumpster. That was a trend lately. People threw away books, sometimes their own, sometimes inherited from the older generation. After all, anything could be found on the internet. Why clutter up the house with dusty tomes? Mom brought books in dirty bags, or just holding them to her chest. Their own library had grown so large that some of it had moved into the guest house in the garden. But the library paid pennies, and my mother wrote term papers and theses for students in the evenings. Behind each work was a specific goal. Things were bought the cheapest, and still ahead loomed a long list of things that could not do without, and every item on that list was a mom's sleepless night. Amber was used to not asking for anything for herself, not even a refill at the table. Too often lunch was cooked for 2 or 3 days. But the girl early had to think about how to adapt her hands and head to some business. At first, Amber helped her grandmother, twiddling her thumbs. If you compare the family to a ship that sails on the sea called everyday life, then Mom could not be called the captain. She wouldn't rise above a diligent sailor. And when my father left, Grandma took the bridge, and Amber became her right hand. Whether it was standing at the stove, peeling apricots, ironing curtains, Amber uncomplainingly learned and did everything, though her nature asked for something else, and she was not a diligent learner. Even when her father lived at home, Amber realized happiness it is when after an early breakfast, snapped out of the house, all the paths are yours, and with the sky you can be alone. And there is so much strength inside you that you perceive as an unfortunate misunderstanding the impossibility to spread your arms and fly to be swayed by warm winds. It was from her father that she got her love of vagabonding. And he also taught his daughter that when you can, all day long you are satisfied with a piece of bread taken from home, as long as it was sprinkled with salt when you memorize the road so that you will never get lost and come back, wherever you have wandered. When you don't pay attention to fatigue, to pains in your legs, and you can walk as long as it takes, if it's worth it. And it was worth it. Amber wasn't looking for beautiful, picture-perfect views like the others. She wasn't taking selfies. She wasn't seeking out some of the youth's favorite pastimes. At first, there was simply not enough money for that, and then the girl began to feel like a white crow among her peers and did not even try to become her own in the pack. She simply did not know and could not discuss what they knew and loved, and what touched her, frightened her, amazed or delighted her, left them completely indifferent. I know what you want to be, Valerie, a classmate who sat at the same desk with Amber, and with whom Amber had a more trusting relationship than with the other kids, once told her. You want to drive field trips. This happened after the teacher assigned them to write a trivial essay about the love of their homeland. Amber was choking on the topic. There was so much to tell. She was steeped in legends as much as her hair was steeped in sea air. I read it. The teacher said to her the next day, "Tell us, I want the boys to hear it too. Tell it in your own words, maybe add something else." She wanted to talk about everything, and about her favorite gorge, near which a robber had once kidnapped a girl, and she, not resigned to her fate, became a mermaid, and about the valley, where long shadows from the rocks of bizarre, sinister figures come to life in the last hour before sunset. The rocks are motionless, and the shadows fluctuate, reaching out to each other, as if talking, gesturing without words, and about the stone, which fulfills wishes, but charges a terrible price for it. It was impossible not to mention. That's when Valerie dropped out, tucking her textbooks into her bag. And instead of English class that day, the class listened to Amber. Among the children were those who went abroad with their parents every summer, or even Christmas vacation. But now they were enthusiastically questioning the girl. Where is that? Have you been there yourself? And how to get there? Do wishes really come true? When she was still in high school, she got a job at a museum complex. There were tons of them. They hired her as a curator. That meant serve, take, get out for herself, for that guy, and for the cleaning lady. And then she started leading tours. You're probably going to be a tour guide, Amber. You're a genius. She bought a car, the loan for which she had to pay off until the second coming. And she took people to places the guides rarely went, unless they were desperate amateurs. Mostly her clients were families or young couples who were no strangers to romance. And many people asked enthusiastically at the end of the tour, don't you take them to the fortress? First in the low season, when it's not too crowded, then with other, already experienced women. And now she had her own page on the internet, and on the author's excursions, which offered Amber, signed up in line. And the excursions became illegal. They were offered as part of other routes in the vicinity. The guide tempted, let's pay a little more per nose and go to the most extraordinary place we have in our neighborhood. But Amber never took anyone to the fortress. It was her sanctuary. Amber never took anyone to the fortress, although for a long time it was a very popular route. Until someone upstairs decided that it could be dangerous for tourists. Stones crumble, and sometimes whole blocks collapse from the fortress walls. Cave vaults collapse. It would be good to reconstruct, but there was no money for reconstruction, of course. Everyone thought that the matter would be limited to drips and hospitalization for a week. At the very least, surgery. But Jerry wasn't getting any better. The tests didn't seem to show anything critical. But the surgeon took him to the table, rather guided by intuition, which has and will continue to help real doctors. Jerry realized he had been cruelly played. He was barely alive, you might say, after a worsening ulcer. When he'd been seized that night, none of the household had thought it was that serious or, one might even say, that bad. But Lisa did not want to long to look at the suffering of her husband. Jerry was lying in the fetal position, afraid to move, so as not to become more painful, and called an ambulance. The head nurse was particularly warm to him. She was the one who came up with the idea of letting Jerry sleep at all costs, because sleep is health. She persuaded the doctor to add sleeping pills to the prescribed medication. And in the process, it was discovered that from the smart devices, it turns out something can escape, and it was hard to take Jerry away from death. He came hard from anesthesia, and for several days even the strongest drugs did not significantly alleviate his suffering. And then his many friends came up with the idea to play his wife, which they could not stand too much. Lisa was in love with herself. And what's worse, after getting married, Jerry, who before that knew every dog in town, began to behave much more withdrawn. It probably wouldn't have had much effect on anyone else, but for Jerry it worked wonders. The pain was greatly reduced. He felt in himself that fracture, after which began, though slow, long, but still the way to recovery. When Lisa complained to her husband that she cannot tolerate women, so she does not get along in any team, for her coquetry, felt that they do not like me, because I am prettier than them, and because you carry me in your arms. Now Lisa was deciding where they would go and whether they would go at all, who to invite to visit and in front of whom to close the door, and so on. Lisa usually visited her husband after visiting hours were over. She and Jerry had a goodwill at the hospital, and once again Lisa was demonstrating that she was different. She didn't fill her bag with cans of hot food, she brought only fruit and water, sitting by her husband's bedside like a graceful butterfly. As she thought herself, a viper, as others thought. But there were enough men on whom Lisa not only did not make any impression, she annoyed them. Usually too much manners, fixated on themselves, accustomed to being served. They asked the same head nurse for a white coat on some pretext. One of the friends was on duty in the corridor, waiting for Lisa to arrive to give the signal. Jerry was asleep in his room. He had gotten his sleep in his sleeping pills early today, and Lisa, entering the room, caught a wild picture. The nurse was wearing almost nothing, only a conventional white robe on her shoulders. The prank the pals had planned turned out to be cruel not only to Lisa, but to Jerry himself. But when they had conceived it, it had seemed so successful that the friends, as they say, had balked at the consequences. Without difficulty, they found a smashing girlfriend of one of them who agreed to play the part. The friends knew Lisa's character well enough to calculate how she would behave. The woman didn't squeal, didn't throw a tantrum. She simply dropped her bag and stormed out of the room. A few minutes later, one of the buddies came out, smiling. The scene gave him pleasure. She was sitting in front of her husband, in a pose that the young woman found the most obscene of all possible. Legs spread, showing off her charms. The nurse was holding a plate of omelets, scooping them into a spoon and clearly about to feed Jerry. She didn't even notice I was asleep, Jerry lamented. They'd chosen a pose so she couldn't see my face. Except that sister's a stripper, for crying out loud. I had no idea what the bastards were up to. I call them up, and they're laughing their asses off. Let her feel for once not like a queen, but take the place she deserves, a bitch in her own right. Lisa hadn't shown up at the hospital since. When Jerry called, she hung up, and when he was discharged, he had to move back in with his parents. He hoped temporarily. Sooner or later, he and Lisa would reconcile. From the balcony, you could see the river. There was a bus ring curled up near the house. There was a mini market and a few stores. Jason would come down here to get groceries, and when he decided to buy what he needed, he'd go back upstairs almost immediately. But sometimes he'd still take a walk to the river. The old houses had long ago pushed the 2- and 3-story mansions away from the embankment, and there was only one way to get to the shore, past the high fences that kept out the elite from the nobility. You should thank us for saving you from that snake. At least we gave you a break. It'll kill you. Jason listened to Jerry's wailing and went about his business. Maybe that's why Jerry came to him. He knew he'd be listened to, but not ridiculed, judged, or bombarded with advice. Jason lived a hermit's life. If it could be said of a man who didn't live in a cave or a hut, whose apartment was on the top floor of a 5-story building, a 2-bedroom in a Khrushchevka on the edge of a big city, and then the private sector began. The serpentine lengthened the way a little, but it was not worth going straight ahead. There were vipers on the slopes when it was warm, and he had to be careful not to step on one. None of Jason's friends lived like him. They considered him a crank, but agreed that perhaps his profession required it. Jason wrote books. Jason walked without realizing he was walking like a prisoner with his hands behind his back, standing by the water for long periods of time. Even if it was windy and damp, the Mississippi was cold just to look at. Sometimes he took a different route and went up into the mountains. It was a short walk to them, just a couple of streets, and here he was at the foot of one of them. And a paved road serpentine led to the top. It was used to take children to the camp every day. There was a mast on the mountain. There was also a radio and television station. Jason brought the girl to his town right after that hike, straight from the Appalachians. They'd rented a room, then inherited the apartment, which Jason had never changed since. And for the few years he and Emily lived here, their house was open to everyone. There wasn't an evening when friends didn't gather, and even the neighbors would come over to listen to guitar songs and say, "You guys don't need a TV." Those who had known him for years said that he had been different before, a romantic with a wanderlust, an athlete who had achieved a lot. A man who was open-minded, even overly so. And Jason had met his Emily on one of his camping trips. Both of them were the kind of reckless people that old songs talk about. The old compass is calibrated, the maps and edges are obtained, and to storms like avalanches, the treacherous trail. Happy to whom the pinching feeling of the road is familiar, but where the wind tears horizons and blows the dawn. But in late October, Jason returned home to bury Emily. The young woman's death had been a tragic accident, but even among her closest friends, no one knew anything for sure. It seemed that Emily had crashed after falling from a height, either during an excursion or during an outing with her husband in the mountains, or maybe on the rocks. It was believable. The boys were not particularly careful, and they'd had all sorts of adventurous adventures before. Jason was writing his second book at the time. The first was well received, and it gave him confidence that the path is chosen correctly. You just need to go and go on it, every day marking the right number of steps. Well, that is lines. Jason went to the sea to finish the novel, and Emily, of course, went with him. It was already low season, and prices were down, so it was hoped that it would be possible to live by the sea for a few months. Money was still tight. Eventually, they got rid of Jason, gave him a chance to live the life he now wanted, and he craved privacy. From then on, he spent most of his time in the apartment, allowing himself nothing but occasional walks. Emily was buried in a closed casket. Jason hadn't notified anyone about the funeral. Whoever found out by chance showed up, and it was immediately apparent that Jason had changed dramatically. He was silent, as if he had water in his mouth, hardly answering questions, ignoring condolences, and apparently wanting to be left alone. Well, grief affects everyone differently. Some people go to people to cry on someone else's shoulder. And some people don't want to expose the bleeding wound in their soul. Before he had a rifle for biathlon and excellent skis. When he gave up sports, he sold it all, but later he bought a gun again, an expensive hunting rifle. Now it hung over his bed at home. It was probably the most valuable thing in the house. But he still wrote books. True, they had changed. If before they were novels, twisted plot, where the adventures of the heroes did not give the reader an extra breath, then now Jason apparently was not capable of such a thing. Once he was fond of biathlon, took places in competitions, and now wrote stories about sports in the style of realism, with knowledge, but not so exciting anymore. Jason looked at his friend without a smile. "What do you need it for?" John asked him one day. He went to his friend's house more often than anyone else. Jason hadn't completely closed the door on his old friends, and everyone knew they could come to him and ask to stay for a few days. For example, if there was a family quarrel. And now John was practically living at his place. You don't go hunting anyway. You say you can't kill anyone. John was confused. He didn't know whether to take it as a joke or as. There was something about Jason's look that. Until now, he'd been sure that his friend was incapable of raising a hand against anyone. Now all he had to do was break the awkward pause and turn the conversation to something else. Well, that was easy. Maybe I'm just saying that. Or was it before? It was clear to everyone Lisa wants to be begged for forgiveness. But in her heart, she's also afraid that John won't have the patience. She's walking the line. In her version, John should demonstrate such a degree of remorse and beg for forgiveness in such ways that it becomes legendary among mutual acquaintances. "How am I supposed to make up with Lisa?" John asked wistfully. "She not only does not want to talk to me on the phone, but also does not let me home." "I don't understand," Jason said. "What are you worried about? Is Lisa alive? That's the most important thing. And the rest." And he waved his hand. But there's another option: John could give up and find someone else. Then Lisa, too, will have to start her life from scratch. And there's nothing worse for her. Amber had a piece of jewelry in her left ear, an earring. For some reason, a single, small ruby drop. It had been threaded in her lobe for as long as Amber could remember. The earring was discreet, and Amber hardly ever thought about it, except once, when she decided at 13 to really pierce both ears and put earrings in. Girls that age have a tendency to want nothing more than earrings in their ears at a certain point in their lives. So John stopped talking and couldn't say anything else. "No, Mom and Grandma," exclaimed at the same time. "Okay, let's go to the beautician." Mom agreed when Amber couldn't resist telling her what she wanted. "And for your birthday, I'll give you earrings, gold. Of course I cannot, but silver." "I'll take this one off." Amber picked up a red droplet with her fingernail. She'd lost her pair anyway, unlike a pirate, wearing it in one ear. Amber looked from one woman to another, and she could feel her loved ones hesitating to tell her anything. Why? Is there something I don't know? Is this some kind of family legend? Do you cherish Sergei as a memory? Amber's eyes lit up. Scary tales were her favorite thing in the world. She'd read them all at the children's library, and she loved the ones with the lions, mermaids, and sorcerers more than the funny stories about girls and bunnies. When you read such things, at night you dare to go out of your room to the toilet, only if you light up the light in the whole apartment. "Just put it on and consider it a fairy tale," her grandmother added. Yes, Grandma had begged. "Let's hope that everyone has already forgotten everything," said Inga's grandmother. "Does this thing bother you?" And if some mysticism lives in their family's history, how did their loved ones hope to keep anything from her? Inga's mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone was going to let it slip, it would be her. But Antonina only averted her eyes. "Then forget about it. And remember that you don't need to know everything." "No. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time," Mom sighed. She caught her grandmother's glance, stopped talking half a word, and as if cut off. No matter how much Inga pestered her, her mother never said a word on the subject. "But it's my ear. Once in that old fortress on the mountain lived the rulers of the area. Imagine that. Where now only the wind walks through empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, not even ruins, and all the stones have been scattered. There used to be life. And thousands of people walk daily along the roads paved with stones. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress: blank walls, windows only in the courtyard. It was the largest and stood on the edge of the cliff. And only much later, having resorted to the unworthy technique of eavesdropping, Inga at least roughly understood what the matter was. Mother often came to her grandmother's house to sit up before going to bed. No matter how tired she was, but to talk, to discuss what had happened during the day, to complain about something, to ask for advice, it was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit down next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the fragments of these whispers that Inga learned the story. As the years passed, the fortress ceased to play its role. There was no need for people to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer and fewer inhabitants. It was a kind of a test to climb the mountains every day, to live near the sky, but to save water for everything else, to go down to the valley for every little thing. There remained old people and those who are faithful to tradition, who want to die close to their native hearth and be buried in the old cemetery next to their loved ones. And inside, it was known, but no one could tell you about it in detail. There were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who had angered the master, or prisoners whom he hoped to exchange for a favorable exchange, were imprisoned here for 20 years. They came to the sea then Inge was about 5 or 6 years old, and she liked such outings very much. Though her family did not make them very often, there was always either work or not enough money. But several times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for a whole day to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy the favorite places, have lunch somewhere in a cafe, wander through the stores where they sell what they do not have in their town, and come home at nightfall to both mother and grandmother. There came a time when the master's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something among them. There was something about the old lords. All members of the clan continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom the land belonged, along with all the people living on it. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but really rules, who decides the question of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. Let's hope everyone's forgotten, Jacob's grandmother pleaded. Is that thing bothering you? And if any mysticism lived in their family's history, loved ones hoped to keep something from her. Mom was clearly the weaker link. If anyone had let it slip, it was her. But Emily only averted her eyes. Then forget about it. And remember, you don't need to know everything. No. We just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mom sighed, catching her grandmother's gaze. She stopped talking halfway through the conversation. And just like that, she was cut off. But it's my ear. Mom often came to Grandma's house to sit up before bed, no matter how tired she was. Talking, discussing what had happened during the day, complaining about something, asking for advice. It was more important than sleep. Sometimes my mother would sit next to my grandmother on the edge of the sofa and whisper with her for so long that she would immediately fall asleep. And it was from the scraps of those whispers that Amber learned the story. No matter how much Amber pestered her, Mom never said another word on the subject. It wasn't until much later, when she resorted to the unseemly trick of eavesdropping, that Amber realized at least roughly what was going on. And inside it was known, but no one could tell about it in detail. There were dungeons. There was even a place where executions were carried out. It happened that those who angered the master, or prisoners, whom he hoped to exchange favorably, were imprisoned here for 20 years. The rulers of the area had once lived in that old fortress on the mountain. To think where now only the wind walks the empty streets, where there are almost no houses left, even the ruins, and those are scattered on the stones, before there was a boiling life. Thousands of people walked the stone-paved roads every day. Water was brought up from the valley. There was a school, a market, and of course fortress walls. And the master of these places had unlimited power. His house, which should have been called a palace, but it was too much like a fortress with blank walls and windows only to the courtyard, was the largest and stood on the very edge over the cliff. There came a time when the host's family also left their home. Now the former rulers of the area lived down by the sea. Over the years they seemed to blend in with the rest of the people, but they did not get lost. There was something of the former rulers in the family. All of them continued to consider themselves a superior race, those to whom this land together with all the people living on it belonged. And necessarily one of the men of the family became, as they would say in Italy, the local don, the one who unofficially but truly rules, who decides matters of life and death, to whom they go to bow and who takes cruel revenge on those who hurt his interests. Over the years, the fortress ceased to play its role. People had no need to hide behind its walls, and there were fewer and fewer inhabitants. To live near the sky, but to save on all other water, to go down to the valley for every little thing, it is a kind of a test. There remained old people, and those who were faithful to tradition, who wanted to die close to their native hearth and be buried in the old cemetery next to their relatives. That day couldn't help but stick in the memory. Amber was wearing a light blue plaid sundress. She was already badly tanned, her blonde hair tangled by the wind. The beach was less crowded than usual. The wind, carrying sand in the face, scared away the vacationers, and the waves on the sea had risen. But Amber ran along the edge of the shore, once on the ankle ran into the water, then retreated, so that the wave did not cover her head, then snatched out of the water some particularly brightly colored pebble. They came to the sea then. Amber was about 5 or 6 years old, and she loved such outings, though the household did not make them very often. There was always work or not enough money. But a few times during the summer they still got in the car and went to the sea for the day, to swim, sit on the shore, enjoy their favorite places, eat lunch in a cafe, wander through the stores that sell things they don't have in their town, and with darkness falling, return home to their mother and grandmother. The girl didn't know that another couple was watching her father and son, who were in a tent nearby. Not everyone could afford to rent a beach house, so most of the tents were empty. But on this windy day, the father and son were more comfortable with the brightly colored fabric protecting them from the flying sand. Even her mother, who was far from any creativity, was admiring her daughter at this moment. If there was an artist or photographer here now, he would definitely admire how good Amber was. Her father looked at the girl and raised his eyebrows questioningly. Look said a boy of about 12, pointing to Amber. There was something haughty in his Oriental appearance and mannerisms. Well, you choose who you like, the boy explained. And don't tell me that's not true. I'm not a little kid anymore, I know. So, yes, I know about the girl who jumped out of the window and crashed, too. Who told you what? Father asked nonchalantly. Well, you see, our wishes don't always end well. Father stretched, put his hands behind his head and said, looking at the sea. The father grinned. Son Emir was the only person who could speak to him like that. No, he hadn't been brought up in the Oriental way, where a child is allowed to do anything until a certain age. Emir knew his turns, knew how to behave properly if he had to. And yet he had no fear of his father, and deep down he was sure that he would go much further than him. Every now and then it would come out. But that's for you. It's different for me, the boy objected. How much do you understand? Did you like her that much? I don't think she was pretty, Emir asked. Well, you chose that one, and I choose this one. I like her. There was no embarrassment in his father's voice. He was just uncomfortable with the story. Nothing for now. Let her live. When she's old enough, I'll take her back to our place. What are you going to do with her? My father's tone was mocking, but there was genuine warmth in it. You're like a Turk. They used to kidnap their brides. Amber had been running up and down the beach, and now she wanted to swim. She was already pretty good in the water, but since her father wasn't with them, her grandmother made her wear a child's inflatable vest that fastened in the front with a drawstring. Amber ran to beg for permission to swim and was animatedly telling her grandmother something, gesticulating. I think it was more slaves, the boy said, surprised. He immediately bent down to his master. Paul, his father, called to the gray-haired man who always accompanied them. Yes, Herman Yefimovich. We'd like to secure the girl for the future, so to speak. Do you know who they are? From their appearance, it seems that if they have come, they have not come from far away. I see. I see your point. Pavel didn't point directly at Amber, but made a certain movement with his eyes. Grandma and Mom were shocked when Paul and the makeup girls from the beauty parlor showed up at their house in the evening. Chewing gum in her mouth, one of them pierced Amber's ear and stuck an earring in it. The maiden, however, was apparently not evil. She chatted with the girl and said that they bring 2-year-olds to her, and in general there is nothing to talk about. 1, 2 and done. That earring is very pretty. It's a stone. Ruby, the stone of love. And it has a tiny little seal on it that you can see if you look closely. Emir smirked. He realized that he had allowed himself more than usual, had behaved even brazenly, and was quite sure that his father would refuse him. But he had chosen a good day, and his father was in a good mood. And in general, it doesn't hurt to check the boundaries of permissible from time to time. Don't cry. Humanly speaking, I understand. I'll tell you what, no one will touch you now. Live as you have lived, raise your little girl. So much that all this will be forgotten quickly, and no one will ever remember you or that earring. But for some reason they put it on try not to cry. The family tried to be indignant at first, to say that it was out of the question, but Paul repeated twice something that frightened everyone, and hinted that misunderstandings with this man could end badly. After all, taking Amber away now is the easy part, and there's little the police can do to help to everyone. The girl will just go missing. It happens, and trying to hide or take her away isn't an option either. If you get the urge, they'll get you from under the ground. Well, what can you do when you're talking about a child? A ring or a bracelet. The baby is growing, the jewelry will quickly become tight. She'll lose the tip. An earring is a reliable thing. Mom, who was scared out of her wits, wiped away her tears with the palm of her hand. Paul shrugged. Stepfather Paul looked at her carefully. Did the slave owners think so too? Grandma put it in. Her voice was creaky for some reason. That's the phrase the relatives clung to. If you sit quietly, do not try to fight, argue. If you do not get on the road, and look, it will pass. Well, you got it right. Once again I say, I'm almost certain that everything will be fine. With that he bowed out. But if you don't go where the tourists take you, the town is quiet and sleepy. Narrow streets, blank stone fences. That's the fence Amber grew up behind. And then when she reached out to people herself when she started working at the museum, the terrible incident was somehow forgotten and erased from her memory. It's been too many years. It's definitely forgotten now. Amber and her red mark. And it was hard to imagine a quieter life than the family led in the following years. Their town is small, less than 30,000 people live here, and it's 24 kilometers from the sea, so even in the summer there is no such pandemonium as on the coast. Mostly those who are interested in history come here. After all, on the maps of this place appeared in the 16th century. And there are plenty of real antiquities here. Caves along the lawn, in the mountains and rocks, where the first settlers huddled so densely that in some places the slopes of the mountains resemble honeycombs. And the guy eventually came back. Why? Why wasn't he in Europe? His father had decided to gradually bring him up to speed, to hand over the reins of power. I just hoped Amber never met him. Her mother secretly followed the fate of the owner, knew that he lived abroad for several years. And when his father came back, his son was still out there somewhere. Yes, he studied in Europe. Mother knew that the master's distant ancestors had once owned a fortress, and now he had built himself a house before which the old fortress was only a pale reflection, a real castle on the seashore. And grandmother used to say that he sits there, God forgive him, like a spider to which the threads of everything dark, gloomy, illegal in their land are drawn. And then in the agreed place sat in their car, and then already took on the role of a guide. Today's job was a little more unusual than before. She had to pick up these guys right at the station. They'd arrived in a matter of days. Sports competitions, a tight schedule, and they wished for such a program. They'd get off the train and go on a tour. And then it's back to the hotel. What's Amber's main concern? That the group was small. As always, she never took more than 4 or 5 people, usually less. And the money had already been transferred to her card. Amber would take the guests in her old car. Usually the less discerning ones would agree, and she'd drive them around the sites. Or her clients did not agree to drive anything but their own foreign cars. The guys must have been inspired by the fact that their guide was such a young girl. But Amber, with a restrained smile, responded to the jokes at the attempted flirting. And then she got everyone in the car so that the oldest in the group was next to her in the front seat. So she stood on the platform and watched the cars slowly pass by. She recognized her clients at once 3 young guys. One look at them and immediately diagnosed them as basketball players, and an older man with them. Even his whiskers are graying. She spoke to herself, looking in the mirror at the man sitting next to her. He reminded her of an elephant. Maybe it's called a Roman profile. But it seemed to Amber that his forehead went so smoothly, without curves, into his nose that it looked like a short elephant trunk. The part of the road ahead was boring, through the steppe. Sometimes cab drivers ask passengers to talk to me, or I'm afraid I'll doze off at the wheel. But Amber was in no danger of that. After all, there were the steppe yaks and their battles, their chiefs, their mounds. Even here she managed to tell fascinating stories, poured the bird, and listened that tourists almost sighed with regret when the sea showed in the distance. After all, that meant the end of the story. Those days were strange. Here, in their climate, where it rarely snows, it happens that you cannot wait for the whole winter. But then the New Year's week was snowy, and tourists did not know what kind of entertainment to think up. They skated on the artificial ice, and the bathhouse, that's for sure, and the equestrian club, and some even ordered a helicopter. And of course the New Year's celebration itself, when in a cafe stylized as a Russian terem, set the tables and until morning was to continue the fun and dancing. Amber thought back to last winter. She'd gotten lucky with an order then. She'd patronized a group flying in from St. Petersburg like chickens, and they hadn't wanted to let her go. They asked her to celebrate New Year's Eve with them at one of the most luxurious recreation centers. This, in addition to the fee for excursions. Igor was married and regretted that it turned out so that his Olga could not come. Suddenly swamped with things at work, and the vouchers were already bought, and Olga kicked him out to rest for 2. And that's when Igor told Amber. And Amber then ran away. She served her part with the band all evening in the arena and escaped to the cottage where they had put her up. One of the guests went after her. It was a dark-haired, pleasant, middle-aged man. He brought champagne and brought no hindsight. It was just that he was an introvert and didn't want to spend the rest of the night in a crowd. Better to sit in the living room with this nice girl, look at the fire in the fireplace and through the panoramic windows at the snow-covered, garland-lit forest, drink champagne and talk. From Amber's point of view, he looked like a raccoon, short in stature, graceful, with deep-set and dark eyes. But Amber had remained silent out of politeness. But now she remembered him, because elephant was a very subtle definition. I think that every person is like some animal. And you? I'm like a dog, I guess. The final point was a restaurant where they served fish that was still swimming in the sea in the morning. She was treated to local wines. Then Amber had to take her guests to the doorstep of the hotel. She didn't drink much wine, but the guys got pretty drunk. They felt like they were friends forever. And they asked Emily to come cheer them on at the competition tomorrow. This time she drove the guests around almost until the evening. She showed them the main resort town. The local nice went aboard a sailing ship with them. It used to be filmed a lot in movies, but now it was a bar. They stood on the observation decks, drank water from the spring, drowned in legends, and bought as a souvenir burlap bags with fragrant herbs. Amber recognized him. His name was Jason, and he wasn't a coach or some kind of chaperone, just a friend of one of the boys' fathers, and he'd come along for the ride. She raised her eyebrows at him now, smiling welcomingly, but she really didn't like these unexpected requests. There was no telling what would pop into her head. "Can I ask you a favor?" the older man asked. "No, I can't go to the fortress." "Amber, don't you take me to the fortress?" Kyle interrupted, and after the third drink he decided to switch to you with her. "Grandmother won't let me go." Kyle looked at her in amazement. "It's dangerous. Caves crumbling. Underground mazes. She won't let me in." "Why not?" Kyle's voice trailed off. You had to listen to him to make out the words. Like her, Jason hadn't had much to drink that night. "Well, what do you want?" Amber explained. Amber stopped the car where few people would. Only someone who knows every rock, every ledge in the area. The road was narrow, a steep slope to the left, the sea below. Here, a dense forest. But at the sight of it, Amber remembered the marshes. The green and lush crowns gave the deceptive impression of a carpet. It looked like moss from afar, but you couldn't step on it, you'd fall through. "There's a Gregory Evans living here. He's the landlord." Jason began slowly, "and they say he's built himself a castle that would make an English queen jealous. I'd like to take a closer look at it. I understand about private property and all that. But will you take me to a place where I can get a good view of the castle? I know it's over the top, but I'll pay." Here Jason started. "I'll show you the path. To the right rose steep cliffs. Such cliffs can be climbed only with mountaineering equipment. No stranger would park here." But Amber found a small ledge. She parked her car so it wouldn't get in the way of anyone driving by. It wasn't a busy road, though it led to nowhere, to a small village with no sights, nothing of interest to tourists. "Divers used to love this place," Amber explained. "They used to have a different road so you could drive a car to the water. These guys always have their gear with them. You know, tents, stuff like that. It's a lot of cargo. And then when they built the castle, they blocked the road. There was even a court case in the end. You know, between the people have a right and private property won. Some people tried to give a damn. Mostly not the people who live here, but the people who come here every year to snorkel." Amber led him to a little noticeable path that went steeply downward, but still allowed him to get down to the sea. Jason stared at her for a few seconds. Amber couldn't tell at once what she saw in that look of gratitude, but it was clearly something else. "The water here is clear, and it feels like you're not swimming, but floating in the blue sky like an angel. Well, someone tried to ride like they used to. True, they chose a time when it was usually quiet, early morning, late evening. They hoped no one would notice them. But people invariably stood on the road, guards, you wouldn't believe it, with real weapons, automatic rifles or something like that. All kinds of camouflage on their chests. So we realized it was serious, so we stopped trying. There's still this trail, it's off to the side. It was laid by the most stubborn. There's a forest almost all the way to the sea. You can go down and snorkel. It's a little awkward to climb back, but you can see the castle from there." "How will you get out of here?" "Hitchhike. There's a hitchhiker every half hour or an hour or less." Jason shrugged. It was a small thing to him. "Thank you, Amber." Anything further, he held out the money to her, but the girl only took one of the bills out of his hand. She was always honest about her work and didn't take tips. "No, girl," Jason said softly. "It all started earlier, much earlier, and thank you for the offer. But I'd like to be alone, and thank you also for the fact that without you, I wouldn't have found this path. Let me wait for you. My mom says the owner's so reclusive because the 90s aren't over for him." It must have been about 20 minutes when the shore came into view. The forest had receded, and he saw a narrow strip of large pebbles. He also saw the castle. It rose up on his right hand and seemed to rise out of the sea, though it was built on a low cliff. It was built of stone of gray, but of such a dark shade that now in the evening light the castle seemed black. Some historian, architect, or art critic would have been tempted to argue that the castle was built in accordance with the traditions of the people who had lived here for centuries. It had nothing in common with Gothic and with those castles and palaces that could not protect their owners from enemies but were works of art in themselves. He nodded his goodbye and started down the path, recognizing it for what it was. In some places he had to hold on to tree roots to keep his balance. Sometimes the path was blocked by ravines, into which one had to descend and then climb down their slippery clay slopes. Really, you had to love diving to come here. Besides, whatever Jason was up to, it wouldn't be worth the delay. It was getting dark soon, and darkness in the south fell quickly, almost in an instant. And Jason remembered the morning Emily had disappeared. He sat at his computer early. He worked best in the morning hours. His head wasn't so clear after that. Emily brought him coffee, came up behind him. All he saw was her hand with the inexpensive metal bracelet. She was placing a steaming cup in front of him. Then he felt the touch of her lips on his hair. Emily kissed him lightly. No, the man who built such a thing thought first of all of his own safety. Blank walls, windows as narrow as loopholes, gates as tall as 3 men. How much evil had to be done to be so afraid of retribution? Engrossed in his work, he didn't realize until 10 o'clock when he felt hungry. Emily hadn't returned by then. It was unbearably sickening to think of what had followed. Desperate searching and terror in his soul from the first minute. Somehow he had been certain from the beginning that something very bad, terribly bad, had happened that could not be undone. Emily couldn't get lost, couldn't hang out with her friends. She didn't have any friends here either. Go to a movie or go swimming. Trouble happened. I'm off to the market. Can you believe it's all over? Not even breakfast, she said. The police, who up to that point had been honestly searching for the young woman, suddenly led further investigation, as if they were certain of the only theory. And it was hardly Jason's fault. Emily was found about 2 weeks later on a beach just like this, by the water. And there was no way of knowing how she could have gotten there. She was lying on the rocks, a broken doll in tattered clothes. And it was only her face that her death had made completely calm. Jason stared at her with shocked eyes. He couldn't even speak, he was at a loss for words. You must have had a fight, the investigator insinuated. So she left. She'd taken her own life, as they say. Emily was the most precious thing in his life. What would he be without her? Quite possibly just carelessness. The investigator retreated a little. The grounds here were beautiful. She wanted to get a closer look. The rocks under her feet crumbled, and she took off. Are you saying that right from the market with a heavy bag without saying anything to anyone? Emily went far away to admire the views. And that's not bullshit to you? The investigator shrugged. Well, it's not like a woman can think of anything. It wasn't until later, asking everyone himself, that Jason found a young merchant who told him. I saw Emily being pushed into the car. It happens to us, the trader said, averting his eyes. Usually these women come back after a while. You were just unlucky. From the same man, Jason had learned about the all-powerful owner of this place. It's no use going to the police with this. He's not only got it in his pocket, they're scared shitless of him. And as you know, I wouldn't be a witness. Life, is more precious. You're already attracting a lot of attention. You'll come home one day and his men will tell you to leave immediately, or they'll find you. Just like that, on the beach. Or maybe they won't find you at all. Wrap it up. You can't fight a crowbar, as they say. And Jason somehow knew Emily hadn't been killed. I mean, not literally killed. She'd gotten a minute and either tried to escape but failed or just threw herself from a height. She had never been afraid of heights in the mountains. One had to watch out for others all the time, keep an eye on her. And heights had done her one last favor. It had saved her from something Emily couldn't bear. Jason had taken her advice, but not because he'd decided to accept it, to forgive it, to forget it. It was just that the master's power here was absolute now, an armor in which no vulnerability could be found. But if you wait, if you put your whole life into waiting for your hour, your minute, your one and only minute, that chance would come sooner or later. Amber was waiting for him by the car. She was squatting on her haunches, picking through small stones, looking for clear quartz shards. It was a habit of hers. "Let's go," she said, getting up and shaking her palms off her shorts. "I knew you'd come out of the dark. I waited." He was genuinely surprised. "How could I leave you?" And yet the light was almost out. And the first thing Amber did when she got behind the wheel was turn on the headlights. "Mom, let's get out of here. I'm scared for some reason." Amber didn't expect those words to come out of her mouth. She'd known about her master her whole life, as long as she could remember, and she'd been to these places near his castle many times. But today this stranger, so strange, so a little like an elephant, by his mere presence stirred her. Now she had a premonition of bad things to come. Like an animal senses an earthquake coming. Her mother had just fed Amber some fried potatoes, poured her some tea, and returned to her knitting. "Where are we going?" she asked. There was a certain irritation in her voice. "Don't even think about it." Mom jumped up. "He really needs you. He's already got a son and a daughter. Let him take care of them." "If I go to my dad's?" Amber asked. "There's almost a direct train there, with only one change at the very end." She knew Amber must have known that they were trapped and had nowhere to go. There wasn't a penny to spare in the family and no relatives or acquaintances willing to take them in. And how do you leave home? It's the only thing they got. Mom lived here for years without ever leaving. She was afraid of everything. She had never been abroad. She was afraid of foreign passports, a foreign language, incomprehensible money, which was incomprehensible how much it would be in rubles. At the first store you would be left without a penny. And my mother was afraid of her country, 2 trains with drunken shift workers, airplanes that crashed, pimps at train stations, swindlers and thieves. "No, no, 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 I'm not letting you on a train across the country." Grandma looked at Mom with an expression that clearly said, "See, I was right," and Mom was embarrassed. But she quickly found a clue. "I'm not saying move in with him," Amber corrected her mom gently. "Just in the same town as him. Maybe he'll give me a job and then I'll get an apartment. I'm an adult, Mom, and you're wrong to say he doesn't want me. He's been sending me money for my birthday all these years, you know it. It's in your book." Amber went to the fortress. It was a kind of place of power for her. The ruins had been closed off from tourists for a while permanently. The risk of accidents had become too great, and the caves and underground passages had to be reinforced to prevent an unexpected collapse. But there was no place in their neighborhood where Amber didn't know the secret paths. Her mother's eyes darted, fingers begging her to stop this conversation, not to lead Amber astray. "I had an acquaintance," Grandma said melancholically. "She was older than me. As a child, she survived in the trenches of Stalingrad. Then she graduated from a fishery technical school and was sent to Sakhalin. She was small in stature, with a point, black eyes, and a big bow in her braid. She traveled with geologists to Vladivostok on a train across the country on the 3rd shelf somewhere, because there were not enough seats. Then by boat to the island, and worked there as a foreman at the combine. These lines, written long ago, really came to life here, in these ancient walls, although now it was no longer possible to meet even 2 or 3 families here. Leaving the car at the foot of the hill, she began to climb up the mountain. And the town died out. Here and there remnants of towers, crooked streets half erased by time, a cemetery. Caves, roofed in the rocks, long ago deserted dwellings, debris, stones, dust and ashes, where the eye finds no joy. 2 or 3 families, like shadows, wander among the bare walls, but barracks for them are native hearths and the temple of their fathers. A black car, over which smooth circles, soaring, draws an eagle on the mountain heights. But Amber knew from somewhere that her great-grandparents had come from this area. Maybe one of them had been a potter or a small merchant who went down to town every day, set up shop. Or maybe there isn't even dust left of their house now. But their souls, they were still here. Amber had spent the night here once. Of course, withheld from her loved ones, not on a bet, and not with a young man. It was just that since childhood she had felt her belonging to this ancient fortress, her kinship with those who lived here. It was well known about her host's ancestors that they owned the very house of which only ruins remained. Amber told her friend at home that she'd stay the night, but she went up to the fortress in the late afternoon and found a spot near the crossroads. There were bushes of dried wormwood poking through the paving stones. There was still a stone arch over one of the roads. Nearby were two nations' ancient temples. One simpler, smaller, trimmed in wood, the other larger, with heavy columns, with doors that in Amber's memory were perpetually locked, though she peered through the windows, trying to see what was inside. These people, generation after generation, had survived here, where every drop of water was precious, and where even grass grew so sparsely on the sun-hot rocks. Survived, fought off enemies, and stayed here after the master's family left, which meant this place was theirs by right, not stolen from them by legal violence. Amber sat here until dawn. At times she was sure she could make out faint light shadows, swift or slow, but she felt no fear. She waited for someone to speak to her, or to give her some sign. The sunset made the fortress an absolutely fantastic sight, and it was particularly vivid itself. It seemed that Amber had never seen such vivid colors of the sky-rich purples, golds, and purples. It was the hour when that which was unimaginable and fabulous in the daytime awakens all the otherworldly power whose breath is in the air in a way that cannot be put into words. It took her a long time to catch a glimpse of meteors, even though her grandmother had told her, "There's a bright one coming." When Amber finally saw the flying stars, she remembered her father's hands as he struck a match to light a cigarette. And she thought maybe God was doing it up there in the sky. Above her head were large stars, like grains of shining salt. Every now and then a long streak of a meteorite could be seen. Amber remembered her childhood. She'd been given a little Unca telescope, and it had been a real shock for her to see for herself, with her own eyes, that the moon was not a golden disk, so natural in the night sky and in pictures that it was almost unnoticeable. No, the moon is a stone ball, riddled with lunar craters, and it hangs in the black void of space. It's one thing to read about it, but it's another to see it. She did not go down into the dungeon, though she had been there before. But she had not brought a flashlight, and without it she was afraid of tripping on the steps, stumbling, falling somewhere. So she walked outside the fortress walls and went to the tomb, the obelisk above which was particularly high on the mountainside. Amber knew that a very young girl was buried here. She had died while even younger than Amber was now. A girl from a wealthy family had carried water to the fortress during the siege. Then her legs got stiff, and she stood up, thinking that every step she took would make a thudding sound on the paving stones beneath her feet. But she walked quite silently, like a spirit, reached the temple and stroked one of the columns. It was a movement of which she was not aware to herself. And then she walked down the alley under the archway, and inhaling the bitter odor of wormwood, thought that this was what the stars smelled like. Then Amber met the dawn next to the grave, but there was still no fear. On the contrary, the feeling that she was not alone was growing in her. Of course, Amber never said a word at home about her nighttime escapade. Mom would have been heartbroken, and Grandma would have freaked out in hindsight. But many times after that, Amber had come here in times of need to regain her inner strength and composure. Skinny as she was, she managed to slip between the bars of the fence. She made the journey again and again with the heavy burden, and her heart failed her. The bird girl. Today she was driving a new group, a husband, wife, and 2 children. The family didn't want to buy shared excursions. With children, you can never guess what if they get carsick, have to stop the car, and what if they get thirsty or have to go back. And the program the mother and father asked to adjust to the children. The girl was 8 and the boy was 5. Not tiring, not hot, interesting, and a place to get drunk and eat. And now she sat in complete silence for a long time on the grass at the edge of the road. Only the wind ruffled her hair and occasionally sang in the narrow streets like the distant sound of strings. For Amber, the main charm was the sea always alive, with its brightest holiday colors, blue, blue, blue-green, and the vegetation still below. Drowning in the greenery of the southern city was very nice. It was a weekday, and this observation deck was not one of the most famous. So when they'd come here, Amber had figured and had no doubt already that they'd be alone on the platform. Amber took them to the Museum of Fairy Tales and walked with her guests along the paths of the park for a long time, talking about fairy tale characters as well as an experienced guide. She worried while the children wondered and marveled to their heart's content to have their pictures taken. Then they had a snack at the cafe and had to finish the day at the observation deck. We had to give the adults a chance to admire the beauty of the area too. But now, when she saw that the Jeep had stopped near the same lot where they were headed, Amber couldn't help herself. She slammed the door and strode toward the black car, taking the distance between them in 4 strides. But at the very last moment they were cut off by a car, a white Cherokee Jeep. It cut them off so unexpectedly and brazenly that it could have been bad. Amber almost drove off the road, and that would have been a disaster. Serpentine roads everywhere, steep slopes everywhere. She felt an icy dread. Not so much for herself, but for the strangers in the car. Damn it. She almost never argued with other drivers, never got into arguments. And though almost always, if something happened on the road, it wasn't her fault, Amber swallowed the chicken that you can't let those women drive and the brainless blonde just as long as they'd leave her alone. And she faltered. Because this Ambo looked at her without the slightest sense of guilt, with such a slight smirk, as if not a person, but a bug he got on the road, which he was about to crush with his foot. And then she recognized him. His portrait was not published in the newspapers, but she often found references to him and his photographs on the internet. Too often the owner's son was involved in all sorts of stories. And usually in a car he'd race with his friends at breakneck speed through the city at night and hit someone, or he'd get into a fight he'd provoked, or there'd be an absolutely scandalous orgy party, for no one had the courage to call it anything else. "Are you crazy?" She lashed out at the guy who stepped on the ground. "Do you realize you almost got us all killed?" Amber remembered the earring. She wanted to see if it covered her hair, but didn't dare. She could only hope that the curly blonde strands hid her earlobes, but it was a futile hope. Resentment struggled with fear in Amber. Especially as it turned out, Emir wasn't traveling alone in the car. He never rode alone, and 2 of his friends of the same age and perhaps even stronger build were now standing beside him, grinning just as unkindly. He looked at her like a landlord coming home to check on his possessions. "I remember you," Emir said, ignoring Amber's anger, ignoring her mood. "Were you the one slapping bare heels on the beach back then? You couldn't forget me either. You're still wearing my sign." The tourists started getting out of the car. Amber should have gone with them, but she stood stiffly as the owner's son walked around her, looking at her from every angle. Looking at her from every angle. "You were such a little girl then. I thought you'd never grow up to be anything good. But you turned out to be pretty good. What do you care? Where do you live?" "I'm not." "What do you really care?" "Because you're coming with us now." You didn't see anything. One of the customers approached them, after the Jeep door had already slammed shut and swallowed Amber. "Who's going to ask you?" The smirk got even wider. Amber knew it was useless to yell. There was no one around to stand up for her but the father of the family. Still, as she was dragged to the car, she cast desperate glances at the family. Unless these people were afraid, if they could tell. "But how are we going to get out of here? We don't even know where we are." The man didn't dare say anything, the woman decided. And his voice wasn't shaking. "Is that clear?" It was late in the evening when Amber's mother came to the hotel where the family was staying. She was distraught and found her daughter's notebook, where Amber had written down the schedule of her excursions and the phone numbers of her clients. Only she, this crying woman, not the police, had dared to tell the husband and wife what had happened on the observation deck. But they didn't remember the license plate number, saying they were in shock. They didn't care. And they stood firm on that. They couldn't give us a good description of the guy. "Shuttle you'll catch." With these words, the guy got into the car and the Jeep sped off so sharply that it almost drove over the tourists' legs. They barely had time to bounce, and a few more minutes coughing, because such a dust rose. The adults were so impressed by the experience that they could not immediately begin to talk, although the children, and break them, trying to understand what was happening. And then they watched through the window as the small figure of a woman, covering her face with her hands, went away. Into the night. A big guy in a black t-shirt with some friends with him. They'd been driving for about 10 minutes now. Amber was sandwiched in the back seat between 2 thugs. She tried to ignore their dirty jokes. She was the only one who needed to scratch out a ghostly chance at salvation. "Just don't throw me into a thorn bush," the phrase popped into Amber's head. And it somehow became the only thing she could cling to like a lifeline. "Why? Have you wanted to go there for a long time? Really? Not only a tour guide, but also a call girl. I haven't seen all the clients' houses yet." Are you taking me to the castle? Amber asked briefly, still ignoring Emir's friends. That's true. You guys don't let anyone in. You're like spiders in a web. But there's always a way out. You haven't. There is a way out. I've already escaped through your father's window. I'm not afraid of death. And what is your way out? I assure you, the gate is like a door to a safe. A flea can't get through. You won't escape, will you? Something had changed. Almost imperceptibly, but Amber felt it. Don't think about chewing through the bars with your teeth. He nodded at her wrist. Why nothing? Amber spoke in a deliberately harsh tone that she had never spoken before in her life. I'm afraid of the fortress. They say there are ghosts there in droves. They step on each other's toes. I had a friend stay there for a night on a dare and she nearly went mad. I'm not afraid of that lock thing you've got going on. Yet, aren't you afraid of anything? Emir asked. The iron confidence and mockery were gone from his voice. Emir thought for a minute, and then became lively. That's a good idea. One of the guys came to life. It's under reconstruction. None of the people are there. Let's stick her in one of those holes. She'll sit there for a day or two and then we'll take her back. It'll be silk. It's better than if that rabid thing starts gnawing on her own veins. Or your throat. He had a premonition of unusual entertainment. There was almost nothing left unavailable to him in this world. He was already satiated. But to shake the family history, for his ancestors had put their enemies, or perhaps captives, in those dreadful caves. It was tempting to do as they did. Come on, let's do it. And if that crazy woman throws herself down, no one will ever think anything of Emir. It's not the same old story with Dad. The owner could do almost anything, but it took a lot of money to cover up that old story. And here's a careless girl climbing a mountain and getting killed. It's her own fault. But Emir had no doubt the girl would never get out of those underground passages. This fool won't run away. Even if there is a small window in such a cave, it is very narrow. You can't fit through it. And if you turn around, you'll find yourself under a cliff. Then all you can do is throw yourself down, just to be sure. Jason needed that inner determination and willingness to pass the point of no return as much as he needed a steady and accurate hand. He would go far away where no other hunters could get to him, and where no one could hear the sound of the shot. Jason would only shoot at a target until he felt he was ready for anything that might come out of his scheme. Jason bought a hunting rifle, according to all the rules, having collected the documents and having a hunting ticket, but it was not worth looking for it afterward in the company of those who wanted to shoot a bird or kill a boar. Afterward, he laundered the trophies. Sharing tales, Jason retreated into the woods. Loneliness had long been his shadow, his second self, and he'd come back without any booty. He had another goal in mind, to preserve his sniper skills and that inner focus that would so easily be lost in the shooting range. When Amber led him to the closest place to the castle, Jason realized once again that it was useless to look for luck here. The castle was too far away from people and too well protected. It wasn't worth trying to get to someone hidden behind its walls. There were other options to consider: access roads, places in the city where the owner occasionally visited. All these years he'd spent money on himself more than sparingly, royalties set aside. And by the time it was decided it was time, he had enough saved up to buy a black market sniper rifle. If Amber's mother kept an eye on her master's life, not for any particular purpose, more out of caution, she sighed in relief when she heard he was leaving the country. Jason, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was waiting for. Even the strongest enemy has a moment of weakness, a moment when he opens up. He had to wait patiently for that moment, not to miss it. At the hotel, he took a room on the second floor with a low-hanging balcony. It wasn't always easy for an outsider to get onto the front of the building, but it wouldn't be a problem for him to get out of here himself if the need arose. Jason knew he would wait patiently, that he would lay his life on it and wait. After all, what would happen to himself afterward was of no concern to him. He didn't think about the consequences, and frankly didn't care about them. But he realized how carefully he had to think over every step, so that his life's work would not remain unfinished. Over the years, the market has become almost unrecognizable. New pavilions and signs have appeared. But this place was revived as early as it is now, although most of the resort visitors were still asleep. Traders were already laying out their goods on the stalls. There had once been merchants in the ancient fortress too, and they had come down every day to set up their shops. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here, so he paid for 2 weeks for now. He'd see how long it would take. He went to the market where Emily had gone on her last day. He needed to get in tune with her. From a common sense point of view, it was inexplicable. But the chance we get often defies all logic. Now the early customer was welcome, and the first saleswoman grabbed Jason with her chatter in her hands, which were already placing the clear yellow plums on the scales. But as he counted out the money, Jason froze, listening to the conversation of the women next door with their wares. Jason remembered that there had been competition then, and he'd been quietly discouraged from taking cucumbers from Peter or apricots from Ahmed. He waters his garden with cesspool waste. Fertilizer, you'll want, he was told. But how could one pass by golden curd, velvety pure apricots, purple grapes, or cucumbers just plucked from the bed? It was impossible to think of anything else but the blissful satisfaction of hunger. Yeah, I know that family. The last thing I thought was that they'd be the ones to get into this kind of trouble. Always so quiet, always the first to say hello when they meet. That girl Amber is either 18 or 19 years old. And why her? That's how that girl got stolen and taken away in broad daylight. The mother's ready to go to the noose. The mother, it turns out, kept it a secret from everyone that her girl had a crush on this boy years ago. Well, she's pretty, I'll give her that. How did you find out? So what witnesses? They all got scared, quickly packed up and left. And now they'll have to find them. And the mothers will say it's all a fabrication, said the full-figured shopkeeper, shifting the apricots so carelessly that the soft sides of the apricots were pitted by her fingers. Now Amber hasn't come home, and the mother's looking for her, because the police are notoriously unreliable. People who saw it all happen, who saw her being dragged into the car, have come forward. But well, if there are witnesses, will the police let it go this time too? And what is your mother not afraid to tell now? Isn't it too late for her to realize it? By God, I think I'm going mad. This is medieval. The master is the Lord. It's always been like that in my lifetime. And it will go on my son has grown up there, said another. When did this happen? Jason asked, forgetting about the change the peddler was counting out for him. What has she got to lose? The only hope now is that everybody will know about it. Maybe then that scum will be ashamed to go all the way. He'll let her go in the end. After he's played with her, he'll let her go. Who can give me the address of this family? Jason asked. I found out yesterday, the full-figured woman said. That's the kind of thing we get. You come here like you're in paradise for a vacation. But not everything is so peaceful and quiet. Well, help. They've always lived poor, and Mom's sure going to need the money now. I don't know whether she's at home or in the hospital. How much medicine costs, can you imagine? Tell me the address, I'll remember it. Please. Do you want to help? One guest. Two women were sitting on the open veranda. One, very old, slouched in a chair with armrests and red eyes. The other, younger, stood toward him, clamping her hands over her mouth, apparently in no doubt what news he had brought. It wasn't 20 minutes before Jason knocked on the gate of the house on the quiet street. The gate was 3 boards, the brown paint peeling off long ago. There was no bell, but even a delicate knock was enough for the unlocked gate to open by itself. Jason followed the path through the garden to the house. Jason raised his palms in a soothing gesture, and Jason's heart ached in a way it hadn't in years. It was as if he'd been transported back to the hour he'd learned of Emily's death. But you're not the police, said the younger one, the mother. And there was more affirmation in it than questioning intonation. I didn't bring bad news. I want to learn something and maybe help. I'm not the police, he said, and he could hear the change in his voice. I understand that you know who your Amber is in whose hands, and that this man has had his eye on her for a long time. Jason realized she was already there. Already tried to raise everyone's ears. It didn't work. She'd been told something like, wait, a young girl's been out for 3 days, ran away, decided not to let you know. Now mother and grandmother were hitting this uncertainty like birds against glass. Their hearts were about to fail. The mother shrugged her shoulders shakily. The shawl thrown over them, apparently grabbed from the bed, didn't help. She went quickly into the room and soon returned with a red-bound album, an old album, the kind they used to glue pictures of children from birth many years ago. That is correct. And a picture of your daughter I'd like to see, if I may. I'll hire a hitman, mother said. Sell everything we have, this house, everything. And we'll hire someone to kill that rotter at last. Her mother opened the album to the last page, stroked the picture of a pretty, blonde-haired girl with big, clear eyes. There was nothing of the modern girl in her. She looked like an easy victim who had fallen into the golden hands of Cochet, who would take her wherever he wanted. The thing to think about right now was how to help Amber. No such thoughts just yet. Tanya, Grandma raised her voice. But he didn't know what to say to both of them, because now all he had to do was risk everything, and no one knew what the consequences of his move would be. Mother dropped her head on the table and cried with her grief. That's right, it had all come to pass. It was as if she were standing over Amber's coffin. It was impossible to question her now, and Jason got the story from his grandmother. She, too, had changed in the last 24 hours. If Jason had known her before, he would have seen how she had aged. Now she was an old woman sitting in front of him, immersed in herself, a little crazy. The mother was still unable to speak coherently. What can you do for her? Again, it was not the mother who asked, but the grandmother. Mother raised her head. At these words, she and grandmother exchanged glances. I'll try to find out where she is. And then it will depend on the circumstances. One more question, please. I know this is difficult for you, but I need to know. You know Amber best. If she escaped, where would she go? Would she go back home, or would she try to hide somewhere? Would she run to the police, or would she go far away without saying a word to anyone? Jason closed his eyes a little, signaling that he'd taken note. The fortress, grandmother said. It had always been the place dearest to her. A place of strength, as they say. She would run there for comfort, and you can hide there so that no one can find you. It's a veritable underground labyrinth. You know that ancient fortress in the cave city. It's undergoing restoration. But somehow I don't doubt that Amber would run there. Don't even think about it, he said sharply. Nowhere, not a single step now, so as not to hurt your daughter or yourself. Your job is to wait. Do you realize how hard it is to wait and do nothing? Have you ever been through anything like this, been in our shoes? Why don't I go there myself? His mother jumped up. What if she's really gone and is hiding there? I'll go and call. Amber really knew the underground labyrinths well. Of course, she couldn't go through all of them. Many of the passages were simply blocked, and no one was going to clear them. Cave vaults were crumbling, their corridors becoming impassable. The last thing Jason would do in his life is tell Amber's grief-stricken relatives about Emily. Because they still had a chance. There was hope. She didn't. But she was just beaten, tastefully, heartily. And then they pushed her into that death chamber that the tour guides liked to scare tourists with. Apparently, Emir and his accomplices did not know these places so well, and this cave was known to everyone. Some said that they could put a prisoner here for decades, setting a completely insane ransom for him. Others said it was the place of execution, and they described in vivid color exactly how. She was risking everything, too. The company she'd fallen into could do anything to her first. There were no witnesses, and then dump her in one of the stone bags to make her go mad. No water, no food, and utter despair. Or even pushed off a cliff. Then again, who would see? This is where you'll sit. Now, the narrow entrance was closed by an iron grate, but Emmer, it turned out, had a key to it. He must have inherited it from his great-grandfather. Maybe we'll stop by again tomorrow, Emir smirked, savoring every word and trying to catch the look of horror in her eyes. Amber was shoved back so hard that she couldn't keep her feet and fell to her knees on the stone floor. The day after tomorrow, then. We have to bring you water, poor thing. But we'll only give it to you if you ask for it very nicely. He didn't wait. Amber couldn't let her hatred suffocate her now, make her do something rash. She walked to the back of the cave, her cell, settled on the stone ledge, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared out the window. Meet us on your knees with your mouth open, advised one of his buddies. Cheeky. Malnourished, covered in rashes. They left, laughing, deliberately loudly discussing the next time they'd visit her. What would they do to her then? Amber didn't move until her acute hearing stopped picking up the sound of their footsteps and voices. There was the sound of a car pulling away, and then she caught her breath. Are you getting into character? Kyle Smith wondered. Like, go ahead and practice with the ghosts until we get there. She couldn't think about her mother and grandmother going crazy at home. The thought of that was mentally distressing. But Amber couldn't suppress the agonizing feeling of thirst. She'd spent the entire day in the heat. She hadn't eaten since this morning. And then there was the worry. Amber stood up and walked over to one of the windows cut into the stone. Rough, irregular squares, just enough to let light into the cave and gauge the thickness of the stone walls. The cave was cold, and it would get even colder at night. Amber knew she didn't have much time. Very little. 24 hours, maybe less, and no one would come here in that time. She didn't even doubt that. Night came and brought no relief. Amber's eyes adjusted to the darkness quickly enough. It wasn't complete thanks to the windows. The night was clear, the moonlight walking through the cave from end to end. Amber was cold, but she didn't notice it herself. Her mind, however, seemed ready to boil. She searched again and again for a way out and didn't find it. She walked slowly around the cave, examining every stone, tapping her fingers on it, but she couldn't see a glimmer of hope anywhere. The cave had been cleaned just for tourists, so that through the iron grating they could see the manicured walls, not the bare stone and ledge that had replaced the prisoner's bench and bed. And there's a rusty piece of iron sticking out. It must have been used to attach a chain, if it was to be put on the prisoner to intimidate him. By the evening of the second day, the thirst was almost unbearable. Amber thought seriously about the possibility that maybe some moisture would show up on the stone walls at night from the temperature difference and could be licked off with her tongue. There was no way to open the iron grate on the door, no way to dig under it. There was no earth here at all, just rock. But far more terrible than the night was the whole of the next day, when, beginning in the morning, she waited every minute for the arrival of her tormentors. She wondered exactly what they had in mind, and realized that she had nothing at all, to defend herself. Every sound made her freeze and hold her breath. But they didn't come. Maybe they thought they'd give her a hard time, make her more cooperative. Maybe Kyle was just distracted by other things. This is my fortress, my place, Amber thought, pressing her forehead against the cold stone. Why the hell can't I do this? Is it really hopeless and these walls won't do anything to help me? The only thing Amber tried was to squeeze through the window. She almost succeeded, but it was the very last step, a desperate move. The only way to get out the window and plummet into the abyss was if there was no other way out and death was preferable. In the corner of the cave, in the darkest corner of the cave, stood a girl. She was probably about 10 or 12 years old. Fragile, thin, as if she were just bones, wearing a floor-length cherry dress that seemed to glow slightly. The girl's hair was braided, and she wore a cap like a bonnet on her head. She navigated the stars pretty well and fell asleep probably around midnight. But she didn't sleep long, about 2 hours. She woke up when it was starting to get light. It was nearing dawn. But the windows of the cave faced north, and it was still dark, though in the east the sky must have already turned blue. At first she thought she was dreaming, because it couldn't be. Never afterward could Amber forget drinking that strange water, or rather the mist that flowed from the jug, but it quenched thirst, and more than that. It gave her strength back. Amber began blinking frequently and even clenched her eyelids, because it couldn't be anything other than hallucinations from nerves and dehydration. The girl walked over to her. Amber realized that if it wasn't a vision of her inflamed brain, she was facing a ghost. But the little visitor was not transparent, only very pale. She picked up a pitcher, and a pitcher she happened to have, and gave Amber a drink. The girl blinked, just as Amber had done before. She was very small, very sad, and lonely to the point of heartbreak. Maybe it had been centuries since she'd had anyone to visit her, no one to fetch water for her. Shinika Amber asked quietly, "Is that you?" The girl was no longer behind Amber, but in front of her, somewhere in the dark depths, and there was a faint glow coming from it. And the girl didn't hesitate any longer. She stepped into the cramped corridor and walked, not even walked squeezed between the walls. Sometimes she had to make an effort to move on. And if something happened here, no one would ever find her. She realized that clearly. With inaudible steps, the girl went to the wall and lay down on the very iron that was sticking out of the stone. Nothing happened, but Amber understood her perfectly. 2 steps were enough for her to get next to the piece of metal and do what the little guest had done, lean on it with her chest and arms. The slit that opened in the wall was so narrow it looked like a trap. Step into it, and it would crush you. So she was startled to the core when suddenly there was a whiff of fresh night air, and they found themselves in a small cave-like alcove at the very foot of the mountain. They had climbed out. There was the trail that ran down from the fortress. Enthusiasm gradually waned. She was going down somewhere, and the way went on endlessly. She seemed forbidden to think about anything. She had to keep going as long as she had the strength. And then, too inwardly, she tuned in to the fact that she would fall in the end. And maybe that wouldn't be the worst outcome. By the end of that first day after Amber's disappearance, Jason knew the license plate numbers of the cars that belonged to the owner's family and his cronies. Amber could have been kept in a castle, most likely where it was even more convenient to hide loose ends, and in case of such a need, literally. And yet there was still some chance that she'd been handled differently, that she was hidden somewhere, and that chance couldn't be dismissed. Jason waited. Amber looked around in panic, searching for the girl with her gaze, but no one was near her anymore. Only there, somewhere up on the slope where the girl's grave was, a light flashed for a moment and then went out. Or maybe it was just a star falling. Jason didn't know how long he'd be here before he learned something, got a clue. But he hadn't left here yet in the late afternoon, and it was already clear that he was going to spend the night. He had managed to get much closer to the castle unnoticed than Amber had let on. He was almost beside the road, and only a keen eye would have recognized him in the green thicket. The sniper rifle was with him, and he would be in trouble if one of his master's men had spotted him. There was no other way to interpret his behavior than ambush and hunt. It wasn't the eagles he'd chosen to hunt. He saw a country and a girl, as if coming from the depths of time. The clothing had a purple hue that made it impossible to distinguish the gender in the darkness. It was something like a long dress, the kind you see in ethnographic museums. The girl stepped back, giving him a view of the cave, and there was Amber, sitting on a stone ledge. Jason fell asleep with his head resting on the damp forest floor. His hearing was keen, and it was unlikely that anyone would be able to approach him undetected. Jason had no idea that at some point his sleep would become so sound that it would transport him to another dimension, where what he saw was real. Jason was awake before dawn had even broken. There was no fatigue, no heaviness in his head. On the contrary, he knew exactly what to do now. He didn't have to decide what was going to happen next. It was as if everything had been decided for him. The panorama shifted, as if a movie camera had decided to film the background. Now the ancient fortress lay before him like a palm of his hand, and it was there that the cave was. The prisoners were in it. He himself looked at it all, lying on the mountainside with a rifle in his hands. It was early morning. A black jeep was driving down the road below. It was getting light when Jason reached the town where he'd started on his way to the fortress. It took him another half hour or so to climb up to the ruins of the fortress, and then, climbing higher to the top, to take the place he had seen in his dream. Now the whole road lay before him. Anyone approaching he would see from a distance, and he would have time to take aim. Children are not responsible for their fathers, but sometimes it is clear from the very beginning that they will surpass them. And would a bullet between the eyes be punishment enough for the master? Suffering measured in moments. But to mourn the flesh of his flesh, the one he nurtured and raised to replace him, it would take years and end with life. For a moment, feelings came over Jason. Such mental strife. He lowered his head and breathed evenly to keep from throwing up. Emir couldn't have gotten here earlier, because that fat turkey would probably be asleep before lunch. But Jason had seen his car against the dawn sky in a brief vision, and now he waited. He didn't even make an attempt to find Amber. A different task now faced him. Logically speaking, the owner's son couldn't have gotten here this early. Jason had to cover his eyes to bring his image back to life. Tall, with a fresh, plump face, large lips, clenched fists. A fortunate man who had never known hard work, but was used to taking down the defenseless. So used to it that he didn't even expect his victims to resent him. Only fear was on the faces raised to him in supplication. Afterward, Jason stood full length on the mountain, a black silhouette against the dawn sky, and stared at the car that had gone down, flipped over, rolled over twice hard, and finally burst into a tall fire. When the murmur of an engine was heard in the distance, all he had to do was move the barrel of his rifle. He was no longer a man, he had become a fearless machine, and all the measurements, calculations were going on as if outside his consciousness. He did not even try to hit the darkened windows of the Jeep. The shot hit the tire. And that was enough. And he was not surprised when he saw the figure of a girl in the distance. She froze, and then slowly began to rise toward him. He had better not meet her, because if he didn't get one chance for luck, they would look for him on the ground and underground. They'd dig deep and they'd find him eventually. He couldn't let anyone suggest that Amber's fate had anything to do with him. He had a little time. He knew that the fire would be visible from afar, that it would not be long before people would be rushing here. But he did not try to hide now, even though he should have covered his tracks as soon as possible. He walked toward the fortress because he knew it was the right thing to do. And he'd only go near her for a minute to make sure she was safe. Amber was already standing 2 feet away from him. And yes, she was in one piece, but there was blood on her cheek and hair. Jason held out his hand as if asking, "What is it?" Jason had his own reason for revenge, and more than a good one. He didn't believe that the dead forgave everything and everyone, that they didn't care about earthly matters. Jason thought that Amelie was only now truly at peace. He also knew that everything he'd signed up for, sending the car into the abyss, was justified, and that no matter what happened to himself, it was okay, because that girl was alive and would live, and no one would ever hurt her again. The man nodded. Then she unclenched her palm, which held the ruby earring torn from her ear. Amber wanted to throw it into the chasm too, but the earring flew a few feet away and disappeared into the dry grass. "He is, isn't he?" Amber asked, pointing at the chasm.